Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the dark and deadly world of Tudor England. So buckle up, because it's not going to be gentle. You're about to step into a time where the air smells like wet cobblestone, and the looming fear of God, and where a single glance, a wrong whisper, or the wrong kind of love could literally get you executed. Yeah, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, what city are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? I'm always curious about who's drifting off with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking down a narrow lane in London. It's 15:30. The stones beneath your boots are slick with a mixture of rainwater and refuse, and you instinctively sidestep a suspicious-looking puddle. Overhead, chimneys belch smoke into a grey sky. A church bell tolls in the distance, slow and grim. You're heading toward a public square, but you're not quite sure why, until you see the crowd gathering. There's a man in the centre, strapped into the pillory. His wrists and neck are locked in place. His shirt is torn, and someone's thrown a cabbage at his face. A woman nearby spits in his direction. A boy yells something crude. You edge closer, and someone whispers to you, "Caught with another man's wife." That's it. That's all it took. In Tudor times, adultery wasn't just a private mistake. It was a community spectacle, a public offence that echoed through every alley and church pew. Whether you were noble or a nobody, if you got caught cheating, your life could unravel fast. And not just your life. Entire families could fall into disgrace, lands lost, inheritances denied, heads, literally, removed. At the very top of this brutal moral pyramid sits King Henry VIII. You know, the one with 6 wives, 2 beheaded, and a legacy as tangled as a forest of thorns. Under Henry's reign, adultery became more than just a sin. It became treason. Especially if you were a woman. Especially if you were his woman. As you walk away from the square, the sounds of laughter and jeering fade behind you, but they linger in your bones. The punishment was public for a reason. It was meant to humiliate, to warn, to deter, and it wasn't reserved for peasants. No one was safe. Not even queens. But here's where it gets more twisted. Imagine you're a Tudor woman, maybe a merchant's wife. You're expected to be faithful, obedient, chaste. Your husband, meanwhile, might be openly chasing serving girls or sneaking off to a brothel. And if he cheats, society shrugs. But if you cheat, suddenly you're paraded through the streets, your hair cut, your clothes ripped, maybe flogged or branded. It's brutal, it's uneven, and it's just beginning. Whispers mattered. In the Tudor world, gossip could destroy you faster than fact. Neighbours told on each other. Servants listened at keyholes. If your husband suspected something, he didn't need proof, just an accusation, a witness, or the town preacher on his side. The legal system was eager to believe the worst, especially if you were a woman or poor or, God help you, both. And then there's religion, because of course, religion is baked into everything here like a loaf of sour bread. The Reformation is cracking England in two, and with it comes a whole new moral panic. Sin isn't just frowned upon anymore, it's deadly. And adultery, that's one of the greatest. You're not just breaking your vows, you're breaking God's design for society. The fire and brimstone preachers love this stuff. They talk about unchaste women with such frothing intensity, you start to wonder if they're a little too into the details. And here's a quirky little fact for you. Some towns actually used animal symbolism to humiliate cheaters. If a man was cuckolded, people might draw horns on his door, or even sneak a real pair of antlers into his home. Get it? Because he's got horns now? It's medieval meme culture. Everyone's in on the joke. Everyone except the guy with ruined honour and no legal recourse. But here's where it gets scarier. You don't even have to commit adultery to suffer the consequences. The suspicion alone could ruin you. A husband could accuse his wife out of jealousy or political motivation. A woman could be arrested for being seen alone with a man. Noble families were especially paranoid. Bloodlines were everything. If a child was suspected to be illegitimate, that could undo decades of alliances and property claims. One bedroom rumour could start a war. Still walking? Good. Let's keep going. Past the butcher's stall now, the scent of blood sharp in your nose. Past the tailor's shop with its colourful bolts of fabric, though you doubt a dress can fix a scandal. Ahead, There's a house with its shutters closed tight. You're told a woman lives there who was once the wife of a local scribe. Beautiful, too beautiful. When her husband found her crying with another man, nothing happened between them, not really. He dragged her into the street. She hasn't been seen in weeks. No charges, just silence. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether this culture of punishment actually worked. Some historians argue that fear kept people in line, that public shame was a deterrent. Others think it only pushed affairs deeper into secrecy, making cheaters more clever and more desperate. Either way, one thing's clear: it didn't stop adultery. It just made it lethal. Now take a moment and imagine yourself back in your modern bed, safe, warm, maybe with someone you trust nearby. Back in Tudor times, trust was fragile, like a candle flame flickering in the wind. And adultery? That was the gust that snuffed it out. But don't get too cozy yet. We're just getting started. Next, we're heading to court. The royal court, where eyes are always watching, and the price of passion is far, far higher than cabbage in the face. You arrive at the gates of a palace. The stones beneath your feet smoother now, swept clean by servants who know better than to let the court see filth. This is where you begin to understand how adultery in Tudor times wasn't just about sex or betrayal, it was about power. And nowhere was that more evident than in the story of Anne Boleyn. You ease your way through the crowd of courtiers, all in velvet and silk, murmuring, bowing, smiling with mouths that hide daggers. You're in Henry VIII's orbit now, and everything here is sharp: the wit, the stares, the stakes. Anne Boleyn strides through the room in a gown so intricately beaded it glimmers like a dangerous promise. She turns heads, but not all those heads turn willingly. You can feel it, right? The tension in the air. She's a commoner rising too quickly. She's not playing the game, she's rewriting it. At first she denies the king. That's what really drives him wild. Anne refuses to be just another mistress, tells him plainly that if he wants her, he'll have to make her queen. Bold move? Especially in a world where most women were expected to curtsy and say yes. But Anne isn't most women. You watch as Henry goes to war, literally and figuratively, to make her his. He breaks from the Catholic Church, reshapes the kingdom, and drags England into a whole new religious era, just so he can put a crown on her head. You're standing there the day she's crowned, feeling the buzz of ambition and danger swirling like perfume. But already the whispers have started. She's proud. She's ambitious. She's got foreign blood. She's a witch. Isn't it funny how quickly a woman goes from muse to monster? Anne gives Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, but no sons. And that, in this cruel system, is everything. You watch his eyes begin to wander. You hear the counsellors whisper behind hands. Maybe she's not just unlucky. Maybe God is punishing them for their sinful union. Maybe she's unfaithful. Suddenly everything Anne ever did looks suspicious. She laughed too loud with a musician. She spoke too long with her brother. She encouraged flirtation, they say. And just like that, suspicion becomes accusation. You see it unfold with your own eyes. 5 men arrested, including her own brother, George Boleyn. You can't even process it. The idea is so monstrous it feels made up. But no, these were the charges. That Anne slept with other men. That she plotted to kill the king. That she committed incest. Are you horrified yet? Because you should be. The evidence? Weak at best. A confession under torture. A date that didn't match her travel records. Gossip. Courtly flirtation twisted into treason. But the machinery was already turning. Henry wanted her gone, and adultery was the perfect excuse. Because here's the trick. When you're queen, cheating on the king isn't just infidelity, it's treason. You're endangering the bloodline. The next heir might not be royal, and that in this world is worse than murder. You watch the trial in stunned silence. Anne, poised, eloquent, stands before a jury of men who've already decided her fate. She denies everything. She doesn't cry. Maybe she knows it wouldn't help. The verdict is guilty. The sentence, death. Her brother is executed first, then the others. Finally Anne. The morning of her execution is bright and oddly still. She wears grey, her hair tucked under a linen cap. You're there, in the crowd, watching as she kneels calmly on the scaffold. A French swordsman stands ready. Henry's final twisted mercy. A cleaner cut, no axe, no mess. Anne speaks. Her last words are loyal to the end. She praises the king. Maybe she's trying to protect Elizabeth. Maybe she just knows it's pointless to rage now. The blade flashes and it's done. And just like that, Adultery has rewritten history. A queen is gone, a princess is marked, and Henry, he's free to marry again, already courting Jane Seymour before the blood has dried. Here's the historical fact. Anne Boleyn's trial is still debated by scholars today. Most agree the evidence was flimsy, manipulated, or outright fabricated. But Henry needed her out of the way. Adultery made it legal, treason made it noble, and the court, ever eager to please, made it fast. And here's your fringe fact. One of the musicians accused alongside Anne, Mark Smeaton, may have been targeted because of his low birth. As a commoner in a world of nobles, he was easy to frame, and his confession, secured under torture, sealed the fate of everyone else. What's debated is this. Was Anne entirely innocent? Some scholars still ask if maybe, just maybe, there was something to the rumours. A moment of flirtation that crossed a line, a secret too dangerous to reveal. But most historians agree, it wasn't justice, it was politics, rage, and royal convenience. Anne Boleyn was sacrificed to protect a king's ego and a country's illusion of divine order. Now you back away from the scaffold, the crowd dispersing around you. You glance up at the palace window where someone else is already watching. Another lady in waiting, another potential queen, another body waiting to be caught in this savage machine. And you've barely scratched the surface. The rules are even harsher for those without a crown. For the next part, we leave behind the court and dive into the black-letter law because the legal system didn't just punish adultery, it built a whole theatre around it. You walk away from the royal court with its silk cloaks and glittering treachery, heading down a quieter corridor of Tudor life where the rules aren't quite as gilded but are just as sharp. The law, that's where we're going next. And not just the law itself, but the way. It seeped into every crack of daily life, like damp through old stone. In Tudor England, adultery wasn't just a matter of hurt feelings. It was a question of ownership, order, and inheritance. The whole legal system was built to make sure nothing disrupted the fragile illusion of control men thought they had over their wives, their homes, and their bloodlines. You pass through a shadowy office lined with parchment scrolls and wooden shelves, the air thick with dust and ink. Here's where Parliament scribbles its intentions into law, and while adultery wasn't always treated as a standalone crime under common law, oh trust me, it absolutely had consequences. It just depended on who you were, who you offended, and what you were worth. Start with the basics. In this world, marriage is a contract, and women are property. Harsh? Yeah, but that's the legal mindset of the time. A wife belongs to her husband. Her fidelity is part of the deal. If she cheats, she hasn't just broken a promise, she's damaged his goods. She's spoiled, to use the charming term some legal records actually include. Her value drops, so guess what? The husband can take legal action. Not just against her, but against the man she slept with. You read that right. If a woman was caught in adultery, the man she cheated with could be sued for criminal conversation. It was basically the Tudor version of a lawsuit for trespassing, except the fence was a human being. And if you think that sounds horrifyingly transactional, congratulations, you're understanding Tudor logic perfectly. But here's where it gets worse. A woman couldn't do the same. If her husband cheated and she was humiliated, maybe even publicly scorned, too bad. She couldn't sue his mistress. In most cases, she couldn't even separate from him without a brutal uphill battle. Adultery by a man was at best a mild embarrassment. For a woman, it was legal damnation. You flip through a heavy law book, the pages rough beneath your fingertips. It's full of strange clauses, some that make sense, others that feel like traps. There's the expectation that any child born within a marriage is the husband's, no matter what. But if rumours started swirling, if someone dared to suggest the child looked a bit too much like the stable boy or the lute player, the husband could petition to have the child declared a bastard, stripping them of any right to inheritance. One rumour could erase a bloodline, and a woman's silence, even her refusal to protest, might be used as evidence against her. You walk into a courtroom. It's not like you imagined. No powdered wigs or solemn dignity here. Just wooden benches, a few scowling men in robes, and a crowd that's a little too excited to hear the details. Trials involving adultery were often tangled with defamation, slander, or worse, charges of conspiracy, especially if politics were involved. You'd think proving adultery would be easy. Just catch someone in the act, right? But Tudor justice demanded witnesses. Proof. Carnal knowledge, as they like to phrase it. So here's where the spycraft starts. Servants were called in to testify. Neighbours swore they'd seen shadows in windows, heard strange noises, seen someone slipping out the back door. Imagine living in a world where every knock on your door might be someone collecting evidence to ruin your life. Privacy was barely a concept, and the more powerful your accuser, the less chance you had of defending yourself. And while this might sound like an elite problem, it wasn't just confined to nobility. Down in the towns and villages, local courts, called ecclesiastical or church courts, handled cases of moral misconduct. A wife suspected of adultery might be hauled before a panel of clergy, expected to confess, repent, or face penance. This could mean public shaming, fines, or even being forced to walk through town in just her shift, her underclothes, as people watched and whispered. Fringe fact incoming. Some church courts kept detailed logs of these cases, complete with all the juicy scandal, which means historians today can actually read transcripts where people argue about whether two people were lying together in a state of uncleanness. These logs are weirdly specific, like they describe noises, positions. One case involved someone breaking into a neighbour's house just to count how many times the bed squeaked. And what about noble families? Here's where it really escalates. If a woman of rank cheated, it didn't just stain her reputation, it could trigger lawsuits, property disputes, or dynastic collapse. You're watching as a titled lord stands up in court, his hands shaking as he reads a statement accusing his wife of infidelity. Not because he wants her punished necessarily, but because he needs to protect his estate. If her son isn't really his, the land might pass to the wrong heir. Titles and fortunes were built on this rigid obsession with blood. But here's the debate. Was this really about morality, or just about control? Historians are split. Some say Tudor society truly believed in a religious mandate to stamp out adultery, that it was about virtue, stability, and honouring God's law. Others argue that all of this, the laws, the courts, the spectacle, was just a tool to keep women subordinate and keep property where men wanted it. Probably a bit of both, right? A cocktail of fear, faith, and financial panic. And through it all, you keep noticing who doesn't get punished. The powerful men, the flirty bishops, the philandering dukes. They pay some fines maybe, or dodge entirely. Their reputations don't shatter like the women's do. If a nobleman was caught with someone's wife, people might gossip. But no one's dragging him in chains to church court. The law, like the sword, cuts one way. So here you are, standing at the edge of Tudor justice. The ink is dry, the verdict is in, and somewhere another woman is being told to confess or be destroyed. The legal system isn't just a hammer, it's a trap door ready to drop beneath you if you misstep. And what happens if you never even got a trial? Next, we head into the world of whispered accusations, torture chambers, and confessions squeezed out between screams. Because in Tudor times, even talking to the wrong person might get you branded a traitor, or worse, a lover. You're slipping down a darker hallway now, literally and figuratively. The flickering torchlight barely lights the damp stone walls as you descend into the underbelly of Tudor suspicion. You're leaving behind courtrooms and pulpits, and stepping into a space where due process isn't even pretending to exist anymore. Here, in the shadowy world of interrogations and informants, the truth doesn't matter. All that matters is what can be made to sound like truth. Welcome to the network of confession, torture, and weaponized gossip, where adultery isn't proven, it's constructed. You enter a small room with a low ceiling and a single chair bolted to the floor. A man is sitting there, hands trembling, his eyes darting toward the door every time it creaks. He's not accused of adultery himself, not directly. He's a servant, a musician, a page boy, but he knows things, or at least he might. And that's enough to make him valuable, or dangerous. The guards are patient, almost friendly at first. They ask him simple questions. Did he see the lady of the house speaking to anyone in secret? Did he ever find notes? Hear strange sounds at night? The man shakes his head. He swears he knows nothing, but it's not about what he knows, it's about what they can make him say. Torture wasn't technically legal in England without a royal warrant, but in high-profile cases involving adultery, treason or both, those warrants were disturbingly easy to come by, especially when the Crown wanted a confession tied up with a little ribbon. You're shown the devices: thumbscrews, the rack, manacles cold as river water. Sometimes they didn't even need to use them. Just letting a man see the rack could open his mouth wide. So the servant talks. He says he saw a man leave the ladies' chamber late one night. No, he didn't see the man's face. Yes, maybe he was wearing green. A nobleman, probably. Maybe Sir Thomas. Yes, that sounds right. Maybe. Maybe not. But the damage is done, because now there's testimony, no matter how vague, no matter how coerced, and that's all the court needs. Upstairs, the gossip spreads like spilled wine soaking into a tapestry. You listen to the housemaids whispering in the corridor, excited and breathless. She always was too bold, one says. Wore red when mourning. She laughed too loud, says another. I knew she had secrets. It doesn't take much. A smile held too long. A glance in the wrong direction. One servant thinks you're too private. Another says, you're too friendly. These are not contradictions, they're both evidence. Gossip wasn't just idle chatter in Tudor England. It was practically currency. Entire cases were built on hearsay. Communities policed each other with a feverish kind of self-righteousness. You're walking through a village square when you hear a woman being called out from a window. Adulteress! Someone screams. She picks up her skirts and hurries down the road, head lowered. Her neighbour saw her with a man last week, that's it. Maybe they were talking, maybe they weren't. But the damage is already leaking through the walls of her marriage. Now picture this. You're a woman living in a house where the walls themselves feel like spies. Your maid might be loyal, or she might be the one who tells your husband that she saw you standing too close to the visiting merchant. You can't win. If you treat your servants kindly, they call it flirtation. If you're cold, you must be hiding something. The kitchen staff whispers while chopping vegetables. The neighbours squint when you walk past. You're caught in a trap of constant performance, and any misstep might be the one that sends you to court, or the scaffold. And it's not just women. Men got tangled in this web too, especially if they were seen as rivals or enemies of someone with power. Maybe you're a young courtier, too handsome for your own good, dancing too close to a queen's cousin. Someone accuses you of unnatural familiarity, and suddenly you're being questioned. Not because you actually did anything, but because taking you down helps someone else climb higher. Quirky twist for you. In some Tudor households they actually employed listeners, people whose sole job was to report on others' behaviour. Not spies in the cloak and dagger sense, just quiet, observant fixtures in the home. They'd pretend to be invisible, hovering in doorways, cleaning up after dinner, folding linens, all while mentally cataloguing every raised eyebrow and misplaced touch. These weren't just nosy servants. They were part of a whole system of surveillance, and they could make or break a reputation with one whispered sentence. One particularly infamous case involves Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, who testified against her own husband and Anne Boleyn, likely under pressure and perhaps out of fear for her own life. Years later, she herself would be accused of helping Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, meet with a lover in secret. Whether she actually did or not remains a hot debate among historians. But she was found guilty and executed, mentally broken by the end. Her story is a haunting reminder that in the world of Tudor gossip and spying, even informants weren't safe. Once you were useful, you were tolerated. Once you were inconvenient, you were disposed of. So where's the debate here? Historians are divided on just how much people believed the accusations they made. Were communities truly convinced that sin was everywhere, infecting households and damning souls? Or were many of these accusations cynical power plays, jealousy, revenge, or a good old-fashioned scramble for favour at court? Probably both. Some people likely thought they were protecting moral order. Others just wanted to watch someone fall. You move back into the light, climbing out of the undercroft where so many truths have been twisted and sharpened into weapons. But the air up here doesn't feel any lighter. You're beginning to see that adultery in Tudor times wasn't just about private relationships. It was a public currency, a weapon, a trap, a performance in a long, gruesome play where everyone had a role, some written in blood. And where does this leave you? With the women, especially the ones with something to lose. The next step on our journey pulls you into the lives of noblewomen and queens, married off like chess pieces and punished like criminals just for wanting a moment of freedom, or even the illusion of choice. Now you're walking across cold flagstones into the echoing halls of a noble household where the fire in the hearth barely touches the chill in the air. The tapestries are thick, embroidered with hunting scenes and Latin mottos no one remembers the meaning of. And somewhere behind one of these velvet curtains, a woman is sitting at her embroidery frame, stitching swans or lilies or some poor romantic symbol of virtue, all while her stomach churns. She's a lady, a wife, a mother, but never a free person. Not really. In Tudor England, women like her lived in gilded cages, married for politics, property or alliances, and if she strayed from her assigned script, even emotionally, her fall would be swift, public and unforgiving. You sit across from her in a quiet solar lit with afternoon haze. Her face is calm, even gracious, but her eyes flicker to the door every few minutes. Her husband's away at court, or at a hunting lodge, or with his mistress, though that part's not spoken aloud. You ask her, quietly, what would happen if she did the same, if she found a bit of solace elsewhere. She gives you a tight smile and says, "Then I would die." And she's not being poetic. In Tudor noble society, adultery was the one sin a woman couldn't afford. Not because it was rare. On the contrary, emotional entanglements, secret letters, even clandestine meetings happened. What mattered was whether you got caught. And if you did, especially as a noble woman, your whole world collapsed in slow motion. Your husband could banish you, strip you of your children, cut you off financially and hand you over to church courts, or worse, to the king's own justice. For queens, adultery was treason. For ladies of the court, it was social annihilation. Meanwhile, their husbands strutted around with mistresses, acknowledged illegitimate children, and barely faced a raised eyebrow. Some even brought their mistresses into the same household. You, think of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, granted a bit later than our main timeline but still relevant, who married for power and dabbled freely with women who knew they would never hold real influence. No heads rolled, no sermons preached, no townspeople gathered to hiss. It's one of those glaring double standards so baked into the culture that no one even bothers to question it anymore. A woman's body was tied to honour, lineage and property. A man's just part of the furniture. If a noble woman gave birth to a child not fathered by her husband, it wasn't just a family issue. It could jeopardise entire estates, titles and alliances. That's why the suspicion of adultery could be as deadly as the act itself, and why noble women were watched constantly, dressed and undressed by attendants, never truly alone. Their entire lives were chaperoned performances of virtue. One of the most chilling examples is Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife. She was young, maybe 16 when she married him, though the records are fuzzy, and she was playful, flirtatious, light. She'd grown up in a household where girls shared beds and secrets, and she may have had relationships before she ever met the king. None of that mattered until it did. Once the rumours started, the court turned on her with astonishing speed. You're there as the council questions her. She's confused, terrified, caught in the tangle of half-truths and fear. Did she love Thomas Culpeper? Did they actually sleep together? No one knows for sure. What's certain is this. She was young, she was alone, and she made the fatal error of believing that love might somehow protect her. It didn't. She was arrested, tried, and executed, all for love letters and private meetings. Whether sex happened or not, no one waited for proof. The suggestion was enough. And then there's Lady Frances Howard. Not a Tudor, but close enough in time to show how the rules persisted. She was tried for murdering her husband so she could marry her lover. The case was wild, full of love potions, confessions, and more than a little political manoeuvring. But buried in all of it was this same idea, that a woman's desire, if not tightly controlled, was dangerous, deadly, treasonous. Here's your quirky fact. There was actually a popular belief at the time that a woman's physical appearance could betray her guilt. If her cheeks flushed too easily, if her eyes darted around, if she had a hot temperament, she might be considered naturally prone to adultery. Physicians, yes, doctors, wrote treatises on the physical signs of unchastity. Some even argued that a woman with a mole on her upper thigh might have inherited her mother's lascivious nature. Imagine being judged by your birthmark, and now for the debate. Scholars argue about whether noblewomen really had any power, or if they simply manoeuvred within the tiny spaces allowed to them. Were they passive victims of a cruel system, or cunning players using what little leverage they had? Some letters, some diaries, suggest that women forged networks of support, confided in each other, even blackmailed back. But others show women crushed under the weight of rules they never agreed to. You follow one such woman through her day. She writes letters to a cousin. She listens at dinner while the men talk politics. She corrects her children's Latin. And she stares, for a long time, at a portrait of a man she once loved before she was married off. She burns the letter she was going to send him. You wonder, for a moment, if she will be remembered. Probably not, unless she's accused of something. Because that's the paradox, right? A woman who obeys becomes invisible. A woman who resists becomes history. And as you move on from this quiet chamber, the candlelight flickering against the carved wainscoting, you realise we've only seen one side of the shame parade. There's another realm of punishment waiting, outside, public, loud, spectacular. The Tudor world didn't just punish adultery in private, it made a show of it. And that's where we're going next. You step out into the open air now, leaving behind the corridors of velvet-lined suffering and emerging into the crisp clang and chatter of the Tudor court. But don't relax just yet. This isn't some romantic Renaissance fair. You're walking into the most dangerous theatre in England, where every gesture is choreographed, every glance recorded, and every word weighed like gold dust or gunpowder. Welcome to the royal court, where courtly love is the prettiest lie you'll ever hear. On the surface, it's all harmless flirtation. Lords in feathered caps and swords on their hips recite verses to ladies who drop handkerchiefs just a little too conveniently. You might think you've wandered into a living poem, but don't be fooled. This is a high-stakes game. You flirt too little, you're cold. You flirt too much, and suddenly someone's whispering that you've compromised your honour. The court doesn't just admire beauty, it consumes it. You watch a page bow deeply before a countess, eyes lowered like a trained dog. He hands her a folded note, probably verse. She doesn't open it until he's gone. You think, how many lives have ended over scraps of poetry like that? This is where the practice of courtly love becomes a tightrope over a pit of spears. It's supposed to be chaste, poetic, a ritual of admiration that never crosses the line. But you know how humans work. That line gets blurry, fast, especially when loneliness and power swirl together like wine in a goblet. Take Sir Thomas Wyatt, for instance, a poet and courtier who may or may not have had a relationship with Anne Boleyn before she became queen. His sonnets describe eyes like fire and hearts unvanquished. Romantic? Yes. Safe? Absolutely not. When Anne fell from favour, Wyatt was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower. He was eventually released, but the message was clear. Don't fall in love with a woman the king wants, and if you already have, forget her. Forget your poems. Forget your name. You start to see that courtly love wasn't love at all. It was performance. A ritual dance that kept everyone in their place. Women had to be graceful, desirable, untouchable. Men had to be charming, clever, reverent. The moment the curtain slipped, when someone actually acted on the feelings the poems only hinted at, it became dangerous. Adultery wasn't just a personal mistake in this world. It was treason. It was political. And worst of all, it was contagious. And oh, how the court loved a scandal. You hear the latest one as you pass through the gallery. A duchess caught smiling too long at the king's cousin. A visiting noble rumoured to have been seen in the wrong wing of the palace after dark. No one has proof. No one needs it. You feel the excitement vibrating through the tapestries. Finally something juicier than grain taxes and foreign ambassadors. The thing about court scandals is they don't have to be real to be effective. All they need is the suggestion of impropriety. That's enough to topple careers, exile wives and destroy reputations. You can be ruined by a letter that might have been yours, or a servant who might have misunderstood what they saw. Evidence? That's optional. Here's your quirky detail for this section. In some elite households, lovers use fruit. Yes, actual fruit, as code. Sending a pear meant, meet me. A pomegranate implied secrecy. A peeled orange, scandalous. It was a strange blend of romance and espionage, where citrus fruit became a stand-in for lust. There are even letters that historians believe were scented with herbs, or crushed flowers to imply longing. Again, beautiful, sure, but deadly if intercepted. You're watching all of this swirl around the women in the court like smoke. They smile, they bow, they dance. But behind their eyes is calculation. How much can they flirt without being accused? How much favour can they gain before it becomes a liability? One too many smiles at the wrong man, and they could be sent back to the country in disgrace. Or worse, accused by jealous rivals of something they never did. And then there's the Queen. Always the Queen. You glance toward the throne where she sits, not speaking, not moving too much, just observing. She's always being watched, but she's also always watching. Every woman around her is a potential rival. Every man is a potential spy. If she shows affection to one, she risks suspicion. If she's too cold, she risks being unloved. And if the king grows bored, her entire existence is up for negotiation. Here's the scholarly debate, though. Was courtly love really just a dangerous trap for women, or did it offer some strategic agency? Some historians argue that women used the system to their advantage, gaining attention, influence, even power through carefully managed flirtation. Others believe it was just another cage, this time gilded with verse and silk. You watch one young woman, maybe 15, rehearse a line of poetry in the hallway, blushing as she speaks it to a mirror. She's just arrived at court. Doesn't know yet that the man she's performing for has already seduced and abandoned 3 others. She still believes in the poems. You feel a quiet kind of dread settle in your stomach, because you already know how this ends. And when someone does cross the line, when a secret affair becomes public, it's always the woman who pays. The man might be exiled, fined, maybe quietly reassigned. The woman is disgraced, shamed, sometimes executed, because in the delicate ecosystem of court, her body is tied to the honour of not just her husband, but her family, her country, and the very crown. So you see now how this glittering world of velvet and violets is actually a minefield. Every word is a step, every compliment a risk, and every romantic gesture could be the first nail in your coffin. But what if you're not a noble? What if you're just a merchant's wife, a tavern girl, a farmer's daughter? Are things any better outside the palace? Or is the punishment just a little more public and a little less poetic? Let's step away from the court and into the cobbled streets again, because next we're heading straight into the mess of public shame. You're out of the palace now, the silken poetry trailing behind like mist, and back on the streets. Real Tudor England. Cobblestones beneath your feet, the scent of boiled cabbage, wood smoke, and waste in the air. A dog trots by with something suspicious in its mouth, and a fishwife yells at her neighbour about unpaid debts. Here, there are no elaborate intrigues or carefully folded love letters. But don't get too comfortable. Adultery might look different in the villages and towns, but the consequences, still savage, still loud, still terrifying. You just get punished in front of your neighbours instead of a court full of nobles. You're standing in the market square of a small town, where the heart of justice beats loudest. Not in some high tower, but right here, in public. There's a commotion ahead. A crowd is gathering, circling around a wooden post. And then you see her. A woman, middle-aged, hair loose and face blotched with humiliation. She's being marched forward, hands bound, while the crowd watches like it's fair day. Her crime? Adultery? Maybe it was proven, maybe it wasn't. But someone accused her. Her husband, perhaps. A neighbour. A priest. And now she's about to be punished in a way that leaves no one in town guessing about what she did. She's placed in the pillory, a device that locks her head and hands in place so that her face is exposed, her neck twisted uncomfortably forward. The townsfolk don't just gawk. They shout. They throw things. Vegetable peels, mud, worse. Some laugh. Others shake their heads in disgust. You overhear a baker say, "Should have kept her legs shut. It's not justice, it's theatre, and she's the main act." The thing is, in many parts of England, adultery wasn't punished by execution, unless it involved treason. But it was still a social and moral crime, especially for women. So instead of death, you got humiliation, spectacular, drawn-out, soul-crushing public humiliation. You didn't just pay a fine, you were paraded through the streets with a sign around your neck that might say, "whore" or "unfaithful." Sometimes your hair was shaved, a visible symbol of disgrace. If your husband was especially vindictive, or if he had the backing of the local parish, you might be flogged, barefoot, shirt torn, with a crowd following like it's some twisted parade. This punishment wasn't spontaneous. It was often arranged by the church courts, who handled sins of the flesh with particularly smug enthusiasm. These weren't criminal trials in the modern sense, they were moral inquests, priests and bishops deciding who was unclean, who had offended God, and how best to make an example of them. And their methods were tailored to maximum social damage. Here's a quirky twist for you. Some towns required adulterers to perform public penance while wearing white sheets or shift gowns. They'd walk through town barefoot carrying a candle, often during Sunday service, while the congregation watched silently. This was called doing open penance, and it was basically a forced confession wrapped in shame. You're there, in the back of a packed chapel, as a trembling woman walks slowly up the aisle with her candle, eyes down, lips moving in a prayer she's probably repeated 50 times already. You watch a girl nudge her mother and whisper. Someone coughs, everyone sees, and it's not just women, men were punished too, especially if they were poor or lacked connections. You pass a thatcher being led through town shirtless, whipped lightly on the back with willow rods as a crowd jeers. His wife walks behind him, not saying a word. Maybe she forgives him. Maybe she doesn't have a choice. Either way, their shame is now a permanent stain on the town's memory. In some places, the label cuckold was so powerful that men would rather flee town than wear it. And don't forget the children. Illegitimate children, bastards in Tudor language, were marked not just by their parents' sins, but by society's cold shoulder. They might be denied apprenticeships, inheritance, even baptism if the local priest was strict enough. One bad decision, and the consequences echoed down generations. You watch as a girl is turned away from a sewing guild. The mistress sniffing, she's not from a clean family. Everyone knows what that means. No one says it. And then there's the gossip. Oh, the gossip. In small communities, nothing stays secret. You spend a day just listening. At the baker's stall, outside the alehouse, behind the churchyard. Everyone has a story. Heard she was meeting him by the stream after dusk. They say she used herbs to make herself desirable. Bet he's not the real father. Gossip doesn't need confirmation. It just needs an echo. And once your name is dragged through the mud, you don't get it clean again. Not in this lifetime. Here's where historians scratch their heads. Was this community-driven justice actually effective? Did public shaming prevent further affairs? Or did it just make people better at hiding? Some argue that these punishments kept social order, that they gave people a sense of moral boundaries. Others say they were tools of control, especially over women, the poor, and anyone who stepped out of line. One thing's for sure, these rituals didn't purify anyone, they just made everyone complicit. The entire village became part of the punishment. It wasn't about redemption, it was about performance, a message. This is what happens when you break the rules. And you're standing at the edge of the crowd again, watching a couple try to walk home after their penance, the woman clutching her shift tight, the man staring straight ahead. No one speaks to them, but everyone watches. As they disappear down the lane, you realise something. In Tudor England, shame didn't fade. It just changed shape. A nickname, a rumour, a memory passed down to children. It didn't matter if the affair even happened. Once the accusation stuck, it was yours forever. But sometimes the rage wasn't satisfied with shame. Sometimes the punishment got personal. Sometimes the mob got involved, and next we're heading into the holy fire itself, the place where adultery and religion collided in the loudest, most self-righteous way possible. The church bell tolls again as you step from the town square into the cold shadow of the parish. You can feel it before you see it, that heavy weight of judgment pressing down from the spire above, thick as the smell of beeswax and damp stone. Inside, the air is still, reverent and claustrophobic, like the walls are leaning in to hear your sins. This is no place of comfort tonight. You're not here for healing, you're here for fire. Because in Tudor England, when adultery met religion, the consequences got truly savage. You're about to walk into a sermon designed to burn you from the inside out. You slide into a pew near the back, careful not to catch anyone's eye. The church is packed, standing room only. People whisper, eyes darting to the front where a woman kneels in her shift, hair undone, pale as parchment. She's the reason they've come. She's the spectacle. But first comes the sermon, The priest steps up to the pulpit, black robes swaying, his voice already rising in righteous fury before the echo has caught up to him. He begins with scripture, of course. Thou shalt not commit adultery, Exodus, clean and simple. But he doesn't stop there. He's turning pages, invoking David and Bathsheba, Jezebel, even the whore of Babylon for good measure. His voice climbs into thunder. Adultery, he warns, is not just a sin of the body, it is a spiritual disease. It poisons the soul. It threatens the entire community. And women, he hammers, must guard their chastity like they guard their homes. The crowd murmurs approval. The woman kneeling doesn't move. This is the fire and brimstone version of morality, fear-stoked, blood-hot, and aimed squarely at women. The Reformation is in full swing now, remember, and England is caught between Catholic guilt and Protestant panic. Sin has become a national obsession, and adultery is Exhibit A. Ministers thunder from pulpits about the collapse of virtue. They call unfaithful women polluted vessels as snares of Satan, doors through which the devil enters. Yes, these are actual phrases recorded in sermons. You sit there trying not to wince, but the church didn't stop at words. Public penance was only the beginning. In many parishes, women were required to confess their sins aloud in front of the congregation, sometimes weekly, until the priest deemed them spiritually restored. Imagine standing up every Sunday, cheeks burning as you mutter, "I beg forgiveness for having lain with a man not my husband," while your neighbours shift uncomfortably beside you, pretending they're not listening. Except they absolutely are. And it wasn't always voluntary. If a woman refused to confess or denied the charges, she could be excommunicated, barred from receiving communion, banned from the community's spiritual life. That might sound minor, but it wasn't. In a world where religion touched every part of your life, birth, marriage, death, being cut off from the church was a living death sentence. You became untouchable, a soul in limbo, sometimes literally buried outside consecrated ground. Here's your quirky fact. Some churches even had designated penance stools, or repentance benches near the front, where accused sinners had to sit week after week in plain sight, while the priest reminded everyone of their crimes. These seats were often made deliberately uncomfortable, narrow, hard, freezing in winter, and carved with moral phrases like, "Woe to the wanton." You sit on one now for a moment, just to feel it. Yeah, that's not just a sermon. That's psychological warfare. But religion wasn't always content with public shaming. In some areas, especially in rural parishes where the priest was the de facto judge, jury and executioner of moral life, harsher penance was ordered. Fasting for weeks, wearing sackcloth in all seasons, whipping yourself as you recited psalms. You're shown a tiny closet behind the altar, where a woman once spent 40 days in isolation, weeping over a love affair that may have been nothing more than a kiss behind the orchard wall. And here's the twist. This system relied on accusations. Church courts didn't send spies. They waited for gossip. Neighbours reported neighbours, husbands reported wives. Mothers-in-law, those all-seeing, ever-judging figures, were especially notorious for dragging young brides to the rector with whispered suspicions. The church encouraged it. It was called presenting sin. The idea was that hiding adultery was as bad as committing it. So silence became complicity. Everyone was expected to snitch, or risk being seen as morally compromised themselves. But not all ministers agreed. That's your scholarly debate for this round. Some preachers argued that public shaming did more harm than good, that it turned repentance into humiliation theatre, more likely to spark resentment than true moral reform. Others, especially the hardline Puritans, believed it wasn't harsh enough. They wanted stricter enforcement, more punishments, longer penance. The church split itself trying to decide just how much pain was godly. And you haven't even gotten to the idea of spiritual contamination. Many religious leaders taught that adultery tainted more than the body. It tainted the soul, and by extension, the entire household. A husband who didn't punish an adulterous wife might himself fall under suspicion of being weak, or worse, softened by a Jezebel. Children born in sin were believed to be predisposed to rebellion, illness, or demonic influence. You think that sounds over the top? There were actual exorcisms performed on children believed to be cursed by their mother's affair. Try sleeping after that thought. You leave the church just as the woman at the altar is dismissed. She walks down the aisle in silence, eyes fixed on the stone floor, the crowd parting like she carries plague. No one speaks to her. No one offers a hand. She's done her penance, but the stain lingers. Always does. You glance back at the pulpit where the minister's begun a new prayer, his voice calm now, even soft. But you can still feel the crackle of judgment in the rafters. So where does that leave us? Religion didn't just condemn adultery, it structured its entire theology around it. It turned sin into drama, confession into spectacle, and salvation into a public test of endurance. And if you're still thinking things can't get worse, well, buckle up. Next, we enter the tower. You're going to spend one last night with a queen who's already heard the sentence. You'll listen to the silence before the sword, and you'll understand just how far the church and the crown were willing to go for virtue. The night air presses heavy as you step through the arched gates of the Tower of London, the torches casting long, trembling shadows against the stone. You're not the only one walking these haunted halls tonight. Somewhere inside, high in the Queen's lodgings, Anne Boleyn is breathing her last hours of borrowed time. You're here to keep watch, not just for her, but for this silence that comes before the fall. There's no crowd tonight, no sermon, no scandal shouted from rooftops. This is quieter, colder, a kind of stillness you can't shake, like a breath being held by history itself. Anne has been imprisoned here for days now. You can still hear the echoes of her footsteps in the corridors, pacing between the narrow walls. The tower isn't just a fortress, it's a waiting room for the condemned. Anne's trial is over, and the verdict was as swift as it was inevitable. Adultery, incest, treason, guilty on all counts. The punishment? Death by beheading. You make your way up the narrow spiral staircase to her rooms. The guards nod as you pass. No one speaks above a whisper here. The Queen is still technically royal, though not for much longer. She's been stripped of her title, her dignity, and the allegiance of most of the court. What remains is the woman. Thin, pale, but still composed. She greets you with a nod, calm, like she's hosting you in her sitting room instead of counting down the final hours of her life. There's a quiet reverence in her presence, but underneath it, you sense something electric. Defiance, fear, maybe both. She adjusts her sleeves and speaks softly to her ladies-in-waiting. She's asked that they not cry, that they keep her company and help her prepare. One brushes her hair, another folds her final letter. You sit beside her for a while, and she tells you about the moment she realised it was over. It wasn't the trial, she says. It was when Henry stopped looking her in the eye. Here's the brutal irony. We still don't know for certain if Anne Boleyn ever committed adultery. The evidence against her was thin, inconsistent, and likely fabricated. Sir Thomas Wyatt, Mark Smeaton, even her brother George. Most modern historians agree their confessions were coerced. Their trials show trials in everything but name. The charges were grotesque. Not just infidelity, but incest, conspiracy, and seduction woven into one lurid tapestry. The real crime, though, Anne failed to deliver a son, and Henry wanted out. You sit there as she tells you about her daughter Elizabeth, just a toddler, too young to know what's happening. Anne worries about what will become of her, whether Henry will care for her, whether the court will let her live in peace. The tragedy is sharp. Elizabeth will grow up to become one of England's greatest monarchs, but tonight, her mother is about to be erased from the family tree entirely. It's always strange how royalty makes blood both sacred and disposable. As the night deepens, a French swordsman is brought in, imported specifically for the execution. Henry, in a final act of twisted mercy, has arranged for Anne to be beheaded by sword rather than axe. It's cleaner, more precise, almost elegant if you can believe such a thing exists in this context. Anne is told this and she actually smiles. She says she's grateful. You try to imagine being thankful for the quality of your executioner. You help her dress in the morning, her final outfit. A dark grey gown with crimson undersleeves, a plain coif covers her hair. She looks smaller now, stripped of her finery, but no less regal. As she steps out into the open courtyard, the silence is unbearable. The crowd has gathered, only the select few allowed within these stone walls. Courtiers, guards, a few officials. The sky above is a cruel kind of blue, cloudless and indifferent. Anne kneels on the scaffold. She speaks, but not of innocence. No accusations, no rage. Instead, she praises the king, calls him a gentle and sovereign lord. Maybe it's strategy. Maybe it's her final act of control. Maybe she's praying that her daughter will be spared. The swordsman stands behind her, sword hidden from view. One of her ladies ties the blindfold. Anne prays, and in a moment so swift you nearly miss it. Her voice falls silent. It's done. No scream, no struggle, just the dull finality of a life extinguished in silence. The crowd does not cheer. They bow their heads, a few cross themselves. You stay longer than you should, staring at the spot where the Queen knelt, wondering how history will remember her. A temptress, a martyr, a pawn. Here's your fringe fact for the night. According to legend, after Anne's execution, her lips moved for several seconds. People swore she tried to speak, her mouth forming silent words. It's likely just myth, born of grief and shock, but it became part of her story. One last whisper history refused to let go, and the scholarly debate, oh, it rages on. Was Anne a tragic victim of a king's fickle heart, or a political operator who played the game and lost? Did she truly betray Henry, or was betrayal just the name men gave to inconvenient women? Some argue she overreached, pushed too hard. Others say she never stood a chance. But everyone agrees, her death changed everything. It was the moment that proved no one, not even a crowned queen, was safe. You walk away slowly, the sound of your footsteps echoing off the walls. Somewhere behind you, a servant washes blood from the scaffold. Anne's body is placed in a narrow chest, hastily nailed shut, and buried in an unmarked grave. Not even a coffin fit for royalty, and yet you carry her with you now. Not just as a figure of scandal, but as a ghost whispering through the centuries. This is what happens when desire, power, and politics collide. Next, we step back out of the tower and into the wider world, where men move freely and women fall harder. You'll see just how wide the gap was between accusation and accountability, depending on whose boots you wore. You're walking away from the tower now, the air still cold in your lungs, but your feet carry you through a different gate, this one into a world where heads don't roll quite so easily. You're back in the courts, the villages, the alleyways where scandals bloom like mould, but this time your focus shifts. You start noticing a pattern. That was there all along, only now it screams. The men always seem to walk away. It's not that men in Tudor England were never punished for adultery. They were. Occasionally. If they were poor, unpopular, or politically inconvenient, they might find themselves fined, imprisoned, or, if unlucky enough to bed a queen, executed. But for the most part, men could do what they wanted. The laws were different. The expectations were different. The consequences were too. Take a moment and picture a wealthy merchant, maybe in Norwich or York. He's got money, he's got status, and he's got a wife 20 years younger than him. She's quiet, dutiful. But he's got a fondness for the barmaid down the road. Everyone knows. He buys her ribbons, visits her flat above the alehouse, maybe even has a child with her. No one says a word. His neighbours might wink, his friends might clap him on the back. His wife? She suffers in silence, because if she strays, she'll be ruined. If he strays, he's just a man being, well, a man. You sit in a parish court one morning and listen as a woman is accused of lechery, which is just the church's fancy word for sexual misconduct. She sobs as she pleads her case, says her husband beat her, abandoned her, took up with another woman. The court listens, nods politely, and then finds her guilty for seeking affection elsewhere. He isn't even present, not required. Because when a man commits adultery, it's often treated as a moral failing. When a woman does, it's treason against the very structure of society, and the law reflects it. In most regions of Tudor England, a husband could petition for divorce or annulment on the grounds of his wife's infidelity. But a wife, she had to prove far more. Cruelty, abandonment, and sometimes even his infidelity wasn't enough. And remember, even getting a legal separation meant you were still legally married. You just weren't living under the same roof. You had no freedom to remarry. Your reputation remained stained. The system made sure women stayed tied, even when they were already broken. Here's a quirky little fact. In some towns, men who were caught cheating could be sentenced to recite public apologies, but they often paid others to do it for them. That's right. There are documented cases where a servant or even a hired actor would stand up in church and confess to sins of the flesh on behalf of their master. Imagine sitting in a pew and hearing someone say, I, Thomas of Green Lane, beg forgiveness for laying with, only to realise it's not even Thomas saying it, just some guy he paid an ale. Meanwhile, women who tried to escape adulterous husbands were often punished twice, once for slander, if they spoke out, and again for defiance, if they fled. The legal system did not want women drawing attention to male misbehaviour. It upset the narrative. Men were supposed to be the head of the household. If the head was corrupted, then what did that say about the whole body? Easier to pretend it didn't happen. There's a man in the court now, not a nobleman, just a yeoman, lean and red-faced, with dirt under his nails. His wife accuses him of adultery. She even presents a witness, a maid who saw him lying in the hayloft with another woman. The judge listens, strokes his beard, and then issues a warning. A warning. No fine, no penance, just a gentle nudge toward reconciliation. The wife is told to pray on it, to forgive, because a woman's virtue lies in patience. You wonder how many women choked on that same line over the years, and yet men could and did use the accusation of adultery to punish their wives. Not because they cared about fidelity necessarily, but because it gave them leverage. Property disputes, inheritance challenges, political rivalries, all of these could be lubricated with an accusation. You start to realise adultery wasn't about love or lust. It was about control. It was a weapon, one that almost always pointed downward. Here's your historical fact. Henry VIII himself was a serial adulterer. He fathered multiple illegitimate children, some of whom he acknowledged, others he didn't. Yet the king was never shamed, never tried, never punished for his behaviour. In fact, his affairs were often seen as signs of masculinity, even vitality. His wives, however, faced the axe for the mere suggestion of infidelity. And that brings us to your scholarly debate. Was this a reflection of Tudor morality, or just plain old patriarchy wrapped in a religious robe? Some argue Tudor society truly saw men's sexuality as naturally uncontrollable, that a man's affair wasn't betrayal but impulse. Others say it was pure power play. Men wrote the laws, ran the courts, and shaped the narrative, so of course they gave themselves an out. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle, festering like a wound they refuse to treat. You step outside now, the court session ending with barely a mutter. The woman who accused her husband walks past you, eyes swollen, hands clenched. No justice today, maybe never. Her neighbours avoid her eyes. Her reputation will suffer, not his. She'll be marked as quarrelsome, jealous, maybe even unwomanly. And the man? He's already at the alehouse, buying drinks and telling the tale in a way that makes him sound like the victim. You're left staring down a path you know leads to 100 more women just like her, branded, ignored, or gaslit into silence, while men build legacies on the same sins. But next, we follow the trail into even darker territory. Because when adultery wasn't just tolerated, but avenged with blood, things got sharp. Daggers, poison, and jealousy so thick it turns deadly. You're about to witness how passion, when trapped and twisted, becomes murder. You follow the blood-stained thread now, out of the courtroom and into the cramped, smoky corridors of Tudor households where lust didn't just ruin reputations, it ended lives. This isn't about humiliation anymore. It's not about penance or moral redemption. This is where we cross into the dark alleys of vengeance, jealousy, and murder. Because in Tudor England, adultery wasn't always punished by law. Sometimes it was punished by blade. You're standing in the main hall of a manor house. Low beams, stone floors, a fire flickering sullenly in the hearth. The scent of meat and rosemary hangs in the air. Upstairs, a lord paces, jaw clenched, while his steward whispers something urgent. It's happened again. Another wife caught, maybe just suspected, with a lover. And this time, he's not going to church. He's not going to court. He's going for the dagger. It's hard to say how often adultery turned bloody in Tudor households because the records are messy. Many of these killings were passed off as sudden quarrels or unfortunate accidents. But you start to notice the pattern. A woman dies of mysterious causes shortly after rumours of infidelity. A servant vanishes after being caught alone with the lady of the house. A husband who walks in unannounced and emerges with blood on his hands, pardoned, even praised for defending his honour. You hear one of these stories firsthand. A squire's wife in Sussex accused of stepping out with a visiting scholar. The husband returned from a hunting trip earlier than expected. No one knows exactly what he saw, but the next morning the scholar was found floating in the river, his skull cracked open like a walnut. No charges filed. just a quiet funeral and a louder warning to the village. Keep your hands to yourself. And here's a sinister quirk for you. Arsenic was sometimes referred to as the inheritance powder. Because what better way to free yourself from an adulterous spouse than a slow, hard-to-detect poison? You're in the kitchen of a country estate now, watching a woman sprinkle something into a pot of stew. Just herbs, you tell yourself. Just seasoning. But the taste goes bitter, and the husband spends 3 weeks moaning in bed before finally slipping away. It wasn't always about revenge. Sometimes it was desperation, an abused wife, an affair discovered, a child that shouldn't be. Poison was silent justice, and it wasn't just the upper classes. Among commoners, bloodshed over adultery wasn't uncommon. It was just harder to hide. In small villages, a jealous husband might confront a rival in the field, fists clenched, knife tucked in his belt. A wife suspected of stepping out might be beaten, sometimes to death, and no one would lift a finger. After all, she brought shame to her household. What was a broken jaw or a bruised rib compared to that? You find a record from a Midlands parish where a man confessed to drowning his wife in a trough after catching her with another man. He claimed she was possessed by wickedness, that he was restoring balance to his household. The court fined him. Fined. The judge said he showed too much zeal, but not without cause. That's the thing. Violence against women in the name of honour was often excused, even applauded, but women fought back too. You read about a brewer's wife in Lincoln who caught her husband in bed with a servant girl. She didn't scream. She didn't flee. She waited until he fell asleep and then drove a fire poker through his thigh. He survived. Barely. And she was sentenced to 3 days in the stocks. The town called her a scold and a shrew. He, somehow, remained the injured party. It's in moments like these that the Tudor mask slips, revealing something much darker beneath. The law might have rules, but the heart has its own, and when betrayal stung too deep, the rules went out the window. No more gossip, no more sermons, just blood on the floor. Here's the scholarly debate for this section. Were these acts of violence the product of personal rage, or were they encouraged, at least implicitly, by the culture itself? Some historians argue that Tudor society endorsed a man's right to correct, or even kill his unfaithful wife. Others insist these were fringe cases, exceptional rather than normal. But when you look at the sheer volume of stories, oral history, court records, even ballads, you start to suspect that this violence wasn't the exception. It was part of the structure. You pass a tavern where a song's being sung loudly and with laughter, a folk ballad about a miller who catches his wife with a baker and hangs her out to dry, literally. The crowd roars. It's a joke to them. Entertainment. You realise how deep the rot goes. Adultery isn't just a sin. It's a narrative. One where the woman's body becomes the site of punishment, comedy and fear. And always, always, it ends badly for her. And yet, despite the danger, despite the laws and the lectures and the knives, people kept doing it. Risking everything for a moment of pleasure or escape or love, or just rebellion. Some because they were lonely, some because they were in love, some because the life they'd been forced into was unbearable, and infidelity felt like the only way to claim a sliver of themselves back. You pause at the edge of a manor garden. It's quiet here, the moon silvering the hedges. You think about how many meetings happened in corners like this, secret, whispered, forbidden. Not all ended in death. Some went unnoticed, unpunished. But not many. Not for long. Because in Tudor England, the heart was never safe. And the home, even less so. Next, we'll travel away from the elite and into the dusty lanes and ale-stained tables of rural communities. Adultery didn't need a crown to destroy a life. In the towns and villages, everyone knew everyone, and justice came with a pitchfork and a sermon. You trade the thick stone walls of the manor house for something smaller now. A timber-frame cottage with a thatched roof. Its wattle and daub walls patched with years of smoke and weather. You're deep in the English countryside where the sheep outnumber the people and gossip spreads faster than the plague. This is commoners' territory. No crowns, no velvet, just mud, thatch, and a whole lot of sharp-eyed neighbours. And if you think adultery only ruined royal lives, think again. Here, it doesn't take much to set the whole village ablaze, with judgment, with shame, sometimes even with vengeance. You arrive in the middle of a gathering. Women with flour-dusted aprons, men in breeches worn thin, children darting barefoot between legs. Something's happened. A woman named Magda, mid-30s, plain-faced, with hands that look more like they belong to a blacksmith than a housewife, has been accused of laying with the miller, not once, but twice. And what's worse, they say the miller's wife walked in on them, right there in the flower store. You edge closer as the town reeve, sort of a part-time judge, part-time tattler, reads aloud the complaint. There's no formal trial, no lawyers, just a half-circle of villagers nodding and muttering, eyes darting to where Magda stands, arms crossed, lips tight. The miller isn't here. Of course not. He's off selling grain, they say, but everyone knows he's hiding. Magda doesn't confess, but she doesn't deny it either. That's enough. The reeve announces her punishment, a walk of penance through the town in her shift, barefoot carrying a wooden ladle as a mock symbol of her serving ways. It sounds quaint until you watch it. They make her strip to her linen underdress. She holds the ladle high while villagers line the road, shouting things that make your stomach twist. Harlot! Filthy cow! A teenager flings mud. A boy throws a turnip. The same people who smiled at her last week now spit in the dirt as she passes. Her face is stone. Her feet bleed on gravel. But she doesn't cry. This is what justice looks like out here. Homegrown, improvised, but devastatingly effective. Public shaming was the preferred method in rural England because it didn't cost anything. No need for officials or dungeons, just your neighbours, your reputation, and the endless echo of a story repeated until it hardens into truth. And these stories never died. You spend time at the alehouse that evening, sitting near the hearth while the old men swap tales. They remember another woman, Joan the baker's wife, who went strange after being caught with a stable hand. She was forced to stand on a barrel outside the church and recite a confession each Sunday for a month. Her hair was cut short to show her shame, and the children called her Joan No-Lover for years after. Even after she died, they say, her name was whispered like a curse, quirky twist. In some towns, they staged mock parades for adulterers. Picture this. A man accused of cheating is tied backward on a donkey, paraded around with pots and pans tied to his waist while the crowd jeers and bangs spoons. It's part punishment, part theatre. Tudor slapstick, if you can believe it. It doesn't matter if he's guilty. The point is the humiliation. Laughter is just another blade. But more often, the women took the brunt. A man accused of adultery might lose a bit of face, sure. He might buy drinks for the whole tavern to make up for it. But a woman? She'd be marked. Literally sometimes. Burned on the cheek with a brand, or forced to wear a scarlet A stitched onto her clothing. Not always, not everywhere, but enough that it haunted every town from Kent to Cumbria. Here's what you start to realise. Adultery wasn't just a sin in rural communities. It was a breach of communal trust. These were tight little ecosystems. Everyone depended on everyone else. If you were sleeping with someone else's husband, you weren't just breaking vows. You were destabilising the entire network. That woman made the cheese your family eats. That man helps bring in your hay. That child might be playing with yours. If trust faltered, the whole village cracked. So the community took justice into its own hands. Not out of piety necessarily, but out of fear. You listen to a midwife explain it over cider. If she'll bed another man, what else'll she lie about? There it is. Adultery wasn't about sex. It was about honesty, predictability, control. And when those crumbled, people got scared. Scared people throw stones. Now comes the scholarly debate. Were these punishments actually mandated by the law, or just local traditions taken too far? Some historians argue that church courts explicitly encouraged public penance. Others say the worst punishments, like shaving heads or branding, were unofficial, born from mob justice rather than legal decree. And that's the thing about rural Tudor justice. It often blurred the line between law and ritual. What mattered wasn't what was legal. What mattered was what the town believed should happen. You visit a different village next. Quiet, a little wealthier, more conservative. There adultery is whispered about but not punished publicly. Instead, the church arranges for discreet separations, hushed fines, and promises made behind closed doors. It's all very civil, very polite. But the result is the same. Women vanish from pews, children are passed off as nieces and names go unspoken. And let's not forget the men who used adultery accusations to settle personal scores. One man reports his rival for lying with his wife, even though he has no evidence. It's just a way to drag his name through the mud. The wife, young, newly married, denies everything. But now the stain is there. The couple moves away within a month. You'll never know if the claim was true, no one will. You end your walk in a small village chapel where a woman kneels alone praying. She was accused once, years ago. The town's mostly forgotten it, she says, but her son hasn't. He left for London at 17 and never wrote back. That's the true toll here. Fathers who won't speak to daughters, husbands who never forgive, children who carry their mother's shame like a ghost in their name. So while the courts handled the paperwork and the nobles played politics, it was places like this where the social cost of adultery hit hardest. No execution, no scaffold, just everyday cruelty, stretched out over years. A look, a joke, a silence that never ends. But what if the shame started before the affair even happened? What if a woman was accused before she'd done anything, before she'd even married? That's where we're headed next. Into the strange, humiliating rituals that tried to test a woman's purity. Because in Tudor England, they didn't just punish adulterers, they tried to predict them. You're led into a small room now, bare walls, one narrow window, and a low wooden table in the centre. There's a jug of water, a cloth, and a candle burning low. You could be in a chapel or a prison. But really you're in a strange sort of laboratory, a place where truth is supposedly found not through reason or law, but through humiliation. This is where the Tudor obsession with chastity goes full throttle. Not just catching adultery after the fact, but trying to prevent it by testing a woman's virtue before she even had a chance to sin. Welcome to the purity inspection. It's as invasive as it sounds. You're here because a young bride-to-be, let's call her Alice, is being examined for signs of virginity. Her betrothed, a reasonably well-off tanner, has demanded proof that she's untouched. And because he's paying for the wedding and her family wants the match, the local priest has agreed. Yes, a priest. Because in Tudor England, virginity wasn't a private matter. It was a legal, religious and financial contract. A woman's hymen was treated like a seal on a scroll. Break it early and everything unravels. Alice doesn't speak. She just sits there, trembling slightly, as a pair of matrons, older women appointed by the parish, prepare for the examination. These women aren't doctors, they're not midwives, they're just experienced, respected, brutal. The process is clinical, cold, and carried out in silence. The matrons check for signs of defloration, a grotesque term that's been passed down for centuries. A stretched membrane, tenderness, discoloration, all of it based on bad science, bad theology, and worse ethics. You're in the corner, watching as Alice stares at the wall. She's not crying, not even blinking much. When it's over, the matrons nod. She's declared intact, a virgin, fit to marry, and just like that her future is secured, her reputation preserved, her dowry unthreatened. But her dignity, that's been chipped away in full view of God and neighbour. This wasn't standard everywhere, but it wasn't exactly rare, either. In communities where money and marriage were tightly bound, and where a woman's purity determined the social value of the entire union, these inspections were tolerated, even celebrated. They were supposed to reassure husbands. Peace of mind, one man calls it. More like legalised violation cloaked in piety. And then there were the post-marriage tests, the infamous bloody sheets. You've probably heard of this one. After the wedding night, a couple's bed sheets were inspected for signs of blood, the so-called proof that the bride had been a virgin. In wealthier households, a servant would carry the sheet through the house the next morning like a victory banner. In villages, neighbours might peek in to see it hanging from the window. If the sheet was clean, whispers, accusations, sometimes annulment. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Some desperate brides faked it. Animal blood, pricked fingers, crushed berries, whatever worked. There were even folk remedies sold in markets to simulate the bleeding. It was all smoke and mirrors, but that's what Tudor morality had come to. Perform chastity convincingly, and you're safe. Fail the performance, and your life might fall apart. And the men? Well, no one checked their purity. No sheet tests, no body inspections. A groom could arrive drunk, dishevelled, and boasting about past adventures, and no one blinked. His experience made him manly. Her experience made her spoiled. This wasn't just double standard, it was systemic imbalance, soaked into every prayer, every rule, every whispered threat. You listen to a midwife in York explain the rules. She's delivered dozens of babies, stitched wounds, and bathed the dying, but still she's called in for maid inspections. She hates it. God sees the heart, she says quietly, but people want to see the blood. And she's right. In Tudor England, faith often bowed to spectacle, and what if a woman failed the inspection? What then? If she was lucky, the marriage was simply called off. Her dowry returned, her reputation dinged but salvageable, especially if her father had money. If she wasn't lucky, she might be declared damaged goods. She could be sent to a convent, or forced into marriage with a man willing to overlook her shame for a reduced price. Sometimes she was simply cast out, sent to distant relatives, forgotten. You visit a convent where two young women are kneeling in prayer. One was found unfit the week before her wedding. The other confessed to loving someone she couldn't marry. Neither has spoken since they arrived. The sisters are kind but distant. These girls are being stored, not saved, kept from view so they can't embarrass anyone. If they're lucky, they'll be allowed to teach letters or tend the sick. If not, they'll grow old in silence, remembered only in family shame logs scribbled in Bibles. And yet, people still fought back. Some. Women refused inspections. Some tore down the bloody sheets and threw them in the fire. One bride in Essex, accused of fornication before marriage, stood in the middle of the square and shouted that her husband was too small a man to judge any part of her. She was fined for vulgarity, but secretly applauded by the alewives for weeks afterward. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these inspections really widespread, or were they rare outliers exaggerated by later historians? The records are patchy. Some regions kept detailed accounts, others make no mention of such tests. Some argue they were more folklore than fact. Others point to church court rulings and midwife manuals that clearly describe them. The truth likely depends on the class, the region, and how desperate a family was to prove, or deny, a daughter's purity. You step outside again, the sky clouded over, the air cool on your skin. Somewhere bells are ringing for a wedding. Somewhere else, a girl is sitting on her bed staring at the door, wondering if the matrons will knock. What this all reveals is that Tudor society didn't just punish adultery after it happened. It prejudged it. It tried to prevent it by controlling women's bodies before they ever had a chance to choose. Virginity wasn't about innocence. It was about surveillance. It was about branding. And for many women, it was just one more hurdle in a world built to see them fall. But what if, despite all this, despite the inspections, the sermons, the threats, a woman did become pregnant by someone other than her husband? That's next. Because in Tudor England, adultery didn't just haunt bedrooms. It left footprints. Small, crying, undeniable footprints. The cries come before you see the baby. Sharp, high-pitched, barely human in their rawness. You follow the sound through a narrow lane, past thatched cottages and smoke-stained brick chimneys, into a small room that smells of blood, sweat, and lavender, trying very hard to cover the other two. A midwife crouches beside the straw-stuffed mattress. A young woman, maybe 17, lies soaked in her own breath and tears. The baby wails in her arms, red and furious, unaware of the disaster it's just been born into. Because in Tudor England, this isn't just a child. This is evidence. Illegitimacy was the ultimate physical proof of adultery. You couldn't hide it. You couldn't pray it away. Once a child was born out of wedlock, or even suspected to be, the world knew, and it punished accordingly. Not just the mother, not just the supposed father, but the child too. The sin in the minds of Tudor society stuck to the baby like tar, passed on through blood and breath. The midwife glances at you, her face tight. She's seen this before. The girl's not married, and she won't name the father. Maybe she truly doesn't know. Maybe she's protecting someone. A farmhand? A married man? A noble? That would be dangerous. She could end up in the stocks, or worse. For now, she just cries and rocks the baby, who is already, at 1 minute old, considered a social problem. You follow the story through the town. Within hours, everyone knows. Women at the bakehouse whisper. The priest frowns over his prayer book. The local reeve debates whether she should be summoned to church court or if they should wait until she's healed. It's not a question of if she'll be punished, only how. Let's break down the options. In many Tudor parishes, women who gave birth to illegitimate children were forced to do public penance. Same white shift, same barefoot walk. Sometimes they had to carry the child with them as they passed through the streets to the church, where they'd kneel before the altar and beg for forgiveness. If they couldn't afford the baptism fee, the baby might go unbaptized for days or weeks. That meant not just social exclusion, but the risk of a soul trapped in limbo, unclaimed by heaven. And what about the fathers? The law technically allowed church courts to summon and fine men accused of fathering illegitimate children, but good luck getting them to show up. Unless there were witnesses, or a written confession, or a very loud midwife, men could easily deny involvement. She lies, they'd say. She beds many. And just like that, the burden flipped back onto the woman. Here's your fringe fact. In some towns, parish officials kept detailed records of illegitimate births, called bastardy books. These books didn't just note names, they recorded rumours, physical descriptions, even whether the baby looked like the alleged father. Imagine reading, in official ink, "The child hath the dark brows of Thomas the Weaver, and lips like his wife's maid." These weren't just documents, they were gossip set in stone. For the child, the stigma began instantly. A bastard couldn't inherit land, couldn't join certain guilds, couldn't hold office. Even if the parents later married, the stain lingered. Legitimization laws varied wildly by region, and most required royal or ecclesiastical approval. That meant money. That meant connections. And if you were poor, too bad. The child would grow up on the fringes, literally without name. That's what the Latin bastardus means. You follow one such child, a boy named Will, now 7 years old. He's clever, good with numbers, but his teacher won't recommend him for apprenticeship. Not worth investing in, the man mutters. Will's mother works in the dairy. No one knows who his father is, or rather everyone thinks they know. There's a miller down the road who avoids the boy's eyes and pays for the family's bread each week. Coincidence, they say. Of course. And sometimes the consequences turned brutal. You hear a story in the next town over. A woman who gave birth in secret, alone, in the woods. The baby was never found. When the woman was discovered, bleeding and dazed, she was accused of infanticide. Whether she killed the child or simply panicked is still debated. But the courts moved quickly. She was hanged within a month. Because in the Tudor world, hiding a pregnancy was practically a confession. Here comes the scholarly debate. Were these punishments driven more by religion or by economics? After all, an illegitimate child meant a child who'd need poor relief, paid for by the parish. That was a financial burden. So was the fear of inheritance disputes, especially in wealthier families. Some historians argue that bastardy laws were less about morality and more about money and land. Others say it was theological, sin made flesh, and society trying to scrub it out before it could spread. Either way, the results were the same. Mothers ruined, children erased, and yes, men sometimes paid a price. If a woman could prove paternity, the man might be forced to pay maintenance, what we'd call child support today. But enforcement was shaky. If he moved away, denied it, married someone else, tough luck. And the parish wasn't exactly in a rush to chase him down. They preferred to punish the person they could catch, and that was always the mother. You walk through a graveyard, quiet now, the stones crooked in the moss. Some of these graves belong to illegitimate children. Most don't even have markers. Unbaptized, unclaimed, unloved, at least in the eyes of the law. Their mothers' names, if recorded, are tucked into church court registers under words like fornication and whoredom. No mention of consent, no record of fear, just blame. And through all of this, the women carried not just the child, but the weight of everyone else's disappointment, judgment, and fury. And sometimes, in their arms, a child they loved deeply. A child who might never fully escape the shadow of how they entered the world. But what if adultery didn't end with a ruined woman or a crying infant? What if it ended in cheers, in celebration? That's next. Because as twisted as it sounds, in Tudor England, Executions were often public entertainment, and the fall of an adulterer could be the most thrilling show in town. You're following the sound of footsteps now, hundreds of them, echoing against the damp cobbles like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. It's early morning, but the streets are already filling. You pass vendors selling dried apples and tankards of weak ale, kids balancing on barrels for a better view, and women with shawls pulled tightly over their heads, whispering prayers or gossip. There's something in the air, not excitement exactly, not dread either. It's the weight of spectacle. Because today someone is going to die, and everyone's here for the show. This is an execution day, and the accused, adultery. Maybe wrapped in treason, maybe not. But the sin is part of the story either way. You're standing near the scaffold now, the wood dark and soaked from last night's rain. A platform of justice, they call it. But it's a stage. Let's not kid ourselves. In Tudor England, executions were theatre, and adultery, especially when tied to politics, scandal or noble blood, was prime box office. You scan the crowd. There are children sitting on their father's shoulders, vendors hawking gingerbread, and pickpockets weaving through skirts. You hear someone say they came from 3 towns over just to see the condemned. You expect to find sorrow here, but mostly you find anticipation. Then the procession begins. The condemned walk slowly, guarded by soldiers, dressed in a plain shift or doublet depending on their station, sometimes barefoot, sometimes robed in symbolic white. They might carry a small cross, or be forced to listen as a priest recites the psalm of repentance. The crowd leans forward. Everyone wants to hear the last words, because in this world, how you die defines how you'll be remembered. Adultery, on its own, wasn't always a capital crime, but add the right or wrong circumstances, and suddenly the bed becomes a battlefield. A queen who cheats? Treason. A noblewoman suspected of sleeping with an enemy spy? Treason. A common woman, pregnant with a married man's child, accused of witchcraft to boot? Executable offence. The moral was simple. Adultery might not always be fatal, but it could be made fatal with the right spin. You watch as the accused climbs the scaffold. The crowd goes still. It's a man today, mid-30s, unshaven, hands trembling. Rumour says he seduced the wife of a powerful magistrate. Others claim he was framed, that the woman was his cousin, that there was no affair at all. But it doesn't matter now. His shirt has been stripped to expose the neck. The executioner tests the blade. The priest leans in, and then the man speaks. This is where things get weirdly formal, because the condemned is expected to perform, to confess, to ask for God's mercy. A good execution, yes, that's a real phrase in this era, is one where the guilty own their sins, show remorse, and affirm the justice of the punishment. This isn't just about dying, it's about teaching the crowd a lesson. Sin leads to death, cheating destroys families, adultery costs lives. Learn from this, you faithful. And don't forget to kneel when you pray. The man does what he's supposed to. Sort of. He confesses, but he also says the woman loved him, that it wasn't seduction, that it wasn't one-sided, that they had a connection. You feel the shift in the crowd. Some frown, others mutter, a few women turn away. The idea that a woman chose to cheat, that complicates the tidy narrative. It makes people uncomfortable. Then comes the blade, fast, sharp, final. The head falls, the body slumps, a gasp, a moment of silence, and then the crowd slowly begins to move. Some cry, some cheer. One man mutters, "That'll teach the rest of them." Another says, "He died brave." Pity. And just like that, the play ends. Here's your fringe. Detail. Executioners sometimes receive tips from the family of the condemned. Extra coin to make the blade quick, the swing clean. If they botched it, delivering multiple blows or striking too high, the crowd might turn on them. Reputation mattered, even for a man who chopped heads for a living. And there were executions for women too, of course. Public hangings and, in especially merciful cases, beheadings. Burnings were rarer in England than on the continent, but they happened, especially when adultery was tangled up with heresy or witchcraft. You hear of one such case in Kent, a woman accused of seducing a priest, bewitching his mind and bearing his child. She was burned at the stake. Her last words reportedly were, "I loved him and he loved me." That was all. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these executions really about morality, or were they tools of state control? Some historians argue they served as warnings, particularly in times of political instability. Executing someone for adultery sent a message: obey the order, keep your vows, don't rock the boat. Others argue these deaths were more about spectacle, about giving people something to rally around, to distract them from their own miseries, and the crowd, for all its noise and judgment, wasn't immune to contradiction. They'd weep one moment, then drink and joke the next. They loved a good execution, but they also loved a good scandal. You pass a vendor selling broadsheets, cheap printed pamphlets describing the crime, the trial, the confession, the death, illustrated with crude woodcuts. Some copies even have fake speeches written after the fact. Because if the real execution was boring, they'd spice it up. The dead can't sue, after all. You find one such pamphlet later that night, by candlelight. It describes the condemned man's affair in lurid detail. He kissed her in the orchard and she wept with sin. It's pure fiction, but it sells. And somewhere, a new scandal is already being whispered about. A new fall. A new sinner to put on the scaffold. You lie awake that night thinking of how many people were destroyed not by the act itself, but by the reaction to it, by the public hunger for blood wrapped in righteousness, by the audience that clapped when the curtain fell. But tomorrow, we head back inside the palace gates, because not all queens were English, and when foreign women married into this mess, they brought their own rules, and often paid a steep price for not knowing how the game was played. You slip back inside the palace walls now, but the air feels different. Heavier, foreign. You're not walking through the tapestried chambers of an English-born queen this time. No, tonight you're stepping into the world of the outsiders. Foreign women who married into the Tudor court and quickly discovered that language, lineage and custom meant nothing when suspicion crept in. These queens crossed seas to marry a king, only to find themselves swallowed whole by a country that expected obedience, silence, and a perfect understanding of rules they were never actually taught. Start with Catherine of Aragon, Spanish princess, Catholic powerhouse. She married Arthur first, Henry VIII's older brother, but he died before anything really began. A few years later, she became queen by marrying Henry himself, and for a while, everything seemed golden. She was dignified, educated, loyal. But as time went on and her womb failed to produce a living son, the air grew cold around her. Her foreignness became a problem. Not just her accent or her dress, but her allegiance. She was Spain before she was England. She was Rome. She was a living link to the Pope, and when Henry decided he wanted Anne Boleyn instead, Catherine's virtue became irrelevant. He couldn't accuse her of adultery. She was too famously pious. But he didn't need to. He invented a new angle, claimed their marriage had never been valid, that sleeping with his brother made her unclean, that God was punishing them for incest. She was exiled from court, forced to live in increasingly remote houses, separated from her daughter Mary, stripped of her title and watched constantly. You walk through the quiet rooms where she spent her last years. No music, no laughter, just letters and prayer. Her crime was nothing more than failure and foreignness, but in Henry's court, that was plenty. Now take Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife, German, Protestant. Selected through portraits and political matchmaking, she arrived in England ready to be queen and was dismissed within weeks. Henry found her unattractive, unrefined. The marriage was never consummated and he moved to annul it as fast as possible. But unlike so many others, Anne survived. She was clever, practical. She agreed to the annulment, accepted a generous settlement, and stayed in England as the king's beloved sister. No accusations of adultery, no exile, no execution. Why? Because she didn't fight. She didn't threaten power. She smiled, stepped aside, and lived. You stand in her chamber, surprisingly warm and sunlit, surrounded by books and tapestries sent from the continent. She has what so many Tudor women never got: comfort, stability, and the key to it was knowing when to play along. But then there's Catherine Howard, young, English by birth, but caught in a trap shaped by her predecessor's foreign failures. Henry's fifth wife, barely more than a teenager when she married him. Raised in a chaotic household, full of flirtations and secrets, she lacked the cold polish of her European rivals. And when her past, lovers, letters, kisses, stolen in dark corridors, caught up with her, The court turned on her like wolves. What made her different? Perhaps it was her youth. Perhaps it was her lack of allies. Or perhaps it was that, unlike the foreign queens, she was supposed to know better. She didn't have a thick accent. She'd grown, up in court. So when the accusations came, they hit harder. She was accused of adultery and possibly treason. The investigation was brutal. Confessions extracted, testimonies turned in, servants interrogated. She was imprisoned in her own apartments before being taken to the Tower. Her final words, they say, were that she died a queen, but would have preferred to die the wife of her first love. And here's your quirky fact. Catherine Howard's ghost is said to haunt Hampton Court Palace. People claim to have heard screams in the hallway, her last desperate plea for mercy as she was dragged away. Of course, ghosts are more metaphor than history. But still, it says something that hers is the one people claim to hear. Not Anne Boleyn's, not Catherine of Aragon's. Catherine Howard, young, naive, and cut down before she even understood the game she was playing. The deeper truth is that foreign queens brought with them not just their clothes and servants, but entire cultural expectations that clashed with the Tudor system. In Spain, a queen might advise the king, argue politics. In Germany, a woman could manage estates, speak her mind. In England, that was dangerous. If you didn't understand the exact tone of the court, when to smile, when to step back, when to stay silent, you could be destroyed. Here's the scholarly debate. Did foreign queens ever truly have a chance in England, or were they always doomed to fail under the weight of cultural paranoia? Some historians argue that queens like Catherine of Aragon wielded real influence, even helped shape policy. Others say they were always skating on thin ice, respected only as long as they bore sons and didn't get in the way. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the mess. These women were strong, but strength wasn't always a currency the court knew how to spend, and the punishments were never equal. A foreign queen accused of adultery would be judged not just as a woman, but as an outsider. Adultery became evidence of disloyalty to the king, yes, but also to the country. It wasn't just personal betrayal, it was political contamination. You walk past a tapestry showing a marriage ceremony, fine clothes, clasped hands, a priest smiling. The image is serene, hopeful. You think of the women who stood at those altars, unaware that the crown they were about to wear came with no safety, just surveillance. And when the suspicion came, they had no family nearby, no allies, no way out. As you leave the palace, you pass a portrait gallery. Queens with eyes like ghosts, their smiles unreadable. Foreign or English, it hardly mattered in the end. They all learned that love in Tudor England wasn't protection, it was leverage. Next, we slip deeper behind the scenes, into the unseen rooms, the quiet hallways, where every whispered word and every creaking floorboard might be heard by someone listening. Because the Tudors didn't just punish adultery, they watched for it, they planned for it, they built a whole system to catch it before it ever happened. You leave the grand chambers and ceremonial halls now, heading down a narrow passageway that feels more like the throat of a castle than a corridor. The air is cooler here, drier, quieter, but not silent. Because in this part of the palace, the hidden part, people are always listening. You walk past servants' doors, hidden staircases, peepholes disguised as wall panels. Welcome to the Tudor surveillance state. The network of eyes and ears built not with spyglasses or cloaks, but with aprons, candles and keys. Adultery didn't just ruin lives in Tudor England, it turned everyone into a potential informant. You start to notice it. The way a lady-in-waiting lingers just a bit too long outside a door. The page boy who carries notes but always reads the address. The laundress who knows exactly whose sheets she's handling and what stains she finds. This wasn't just household efficiency, it was intelligence gathering. The royal household, especially the queen's, functioned like a living surveillance organism, and every person within it was both vulnerable and potentially weaponized. If a queen was suspected of adultery, it rarely started with proof. It started with whispers, and those whispers came from the people closest to her. Servants, companions, grooms, even the people who dressed her. You step into a dressing chamber now, modest, cosy, a fireplace smouldering low in the corner. Two women stand at a table folding gowns, but their eyes flick up when the door creaks. You can feel the tension. They know things. They always do. When Anne Boleyn was investigated, it was her own lady-in-waiting, Lady Rochford, who was said to have aided, or at least failed to prevent, her secret meetings. Whether it was true or coerced is still debated. But what matters is this. No one was ever truly alone. There were always eyes in the room. And silence wasn't loyalty. It was a gamble. If you kept your mouth shut and someone else spoke first, you could go down with the ship. So better to speak early. Better to offer information before it's demanded. That was how you survived. And sometimes, the Crown actively planted spies. You're shown a small chamber built into the palace wall with a tiny slit cut through to the next room. For ventilation, someone once claimed. But you can hear through it, clearly. In high-profile cases, Henry's council placed informants among his wife's household staff, people instructed to report any signs of secret meetings, coded messages, or strange behaviours. Imagine living under that kind of pressure, knowing your most private moments were being monitored for evidence of treason disguised as affection. Quirky fact incoming. Some Tudor nobles trained their parrots, yes, parrots, to mimic phrases overheard in bedrooms or private conversations. One noblewoman's bird reportedly repeated the name of a visiting courtier so often that her husband began to suspect an affair. Whether it was a joke or a genuine concern, he had the man questioned. The affair was never proven, but the bird got passed off to a neighbour just to be safe. You start to see how deep this culture of surveillance went. Even in your own home, as a noble or merchant, your staff could turn against you. A kitchen maid who sees her mistress slip out for an evening walk with the stablemaster might hold on to that information until she needs it. A favour owed, a punishment avoided, a rival brought low. You hear a story of a groom who was caught peering through the shutters of the lady of the house. He claimed he was checking the window latch, but a week later, the husband accused her of adultery, citing the groom as his witness. Coincidence? Unlikely. Here's where it gets nastier. Letters. In a world without phones or private messaging, letters were everything, and they were almost never secure. A note passed from hand to hand could be read 3 times before it reached its recipient. In some cases, servants were ordered to steam open wax seals, then reseal them with new ones. If the letter contained romantic language, "My heart longs for your touch," or some equally flowery disaster, it could be read aloud in court as evidence. You walk into a study now and see a whole stack of these. Parchment confessions. Words turned weapons. And that brings us to the larger picture. Adultery wasn't just about sex. It was about secrets. It was about the ability to conduct a relationship, romantic, political, or both, outside of official control. That was the true threat. When people fell in love without permission, they created alliances the state couldn't monitor, and that made the Crown nervous, very nervous. Some scholars argue that this is why adultery was treated so severely at court, not because it broke moral codes, but because it created pockets of influence outside the king's reach. Think about it. If a noblewoman fell for a courtier, she might tell him secrets. He might influence her. They might act together in ways the court couldn't predict. That kind of unregulated connection. Dangerous, especially when everything in Tudor politics was balanced on the sharp edge of trust. But not everyone agrees. Others say the obsession with adultery was less political and more personal, that the Tudors, Henry especially, were simply jealous, insecure and desperate for control. Surveillance wasn't a policy, it was paranoia. Henry was a man whose ego grew with every crown he wore, a man who saw betrayal in every shadow. So he built a palace that watched itself, a home that policed its own sins. And you? You can't help but wonder how anyone could fall in love in a place like this. How could you write a love letter when you knew a chamberlain might be reading it? How could you sneak a kiss when the lady folding your stockings was reporting to the Privy Council? As you walk out of the servants' wing, you pass a woman with her head down, arms full of laundry. She doesn't speak, but she doesn't need to. Her eyes flick up just long enough to remind you, nothing here is private. Not your secrets, not your body, not your heart. Next, we slip from court into cathedral, because it wasn't just nobles and queens tangled in lust and lies. The clergy had their own mess, and when men of God started sinning like men of flesh, the hypocrisy could shatter a community. You move now from the whispering corridors of palaces to the solemn stillness of a church. Not just any chapel either, but the grand kind. The kind with vaulted ceilings that disappear into darkness, stained glass windows that glow like saints on fire, and incense thick enough to choke on. The kind of place meant to make you feel small and watched even when you're alone. This is where sin is supposed to be confessed and absolved, not committed. But the Tudor clergy? Well, let's just say they weren't all shining beacons of purity. In fact, some of them were deeply entangled in the very sins they preached against. You walk past the pews, the wooden benches smooth and worn from generations of knees. A priest stands near the altar, robes fluttering as he murmurs a litany. He looks holy, detached, a little bored. But don't let that fool you. This is the same man who, rumour has it, keeps a housekeeper who isn't just there to do the laundry. No one says it outright, of course, but they know. Everyone knows. And everyone looks the other way, because in Tudor England, power cloaked in piety could get away with just about anything. Before the Reformation, Catholic clergy were bound by celibacy. In theory. In practice. You'd be amazed how many priests, friars and monks had nephews that looked suspiciously like them. Or housekeepers, who suddenly vanished for 9 months and returned with someone else's baby. The system was an open secret, like a cracked confessional, private enough to deny, public enough to control. You hear one townswoman mutter, "He takes our tithes, but he's taken more than that behind the altar, I'll wager." And once the Reformation hit, things didn't get much better, just messier. The shift from Catholicism to Protestantism, under Henry VIII and later Edward VI, Elizabeth, and back again under Mary, created a moral and administrative chaos. 1 year, clergy were required to be celibate. The next, they were ordered to marry or be removed from their posts. You imagine being a country vicar trying to figure out whether his marriage was legal this week. A spiritual roulette wheel. And when the rules shifted too fast, enforcement fell apart. Affairs happened. Confessions leaked. Congregations began to grumble that their spiritual leaders had no business scolding anyone else. You hear the story of a parish priest in Kent who fathered 3 children with a widow in his village. When confronted, he quoted the Apostle Paul, badly, and said he struggled. With the flesh like all men, he was fined, removed, reinstated 2 years later when a different bishop took over and decided the matter wasn't worth pursuing. That same priest later gave a fire and brimstone sermon on adultery and moral decay, pointing at a couple in the third row the entire time. Here's your quirky fact for the night. Some Tudor bishops kept lists of priests who were notoriously incontinent, an official term meaning can't keep it in their cassock. These lists were circulated discreetly, often kept in sealed documents that only certain church officials could open. They read like a medieval version of a scandal blog. Richard of Hereford, 2 known bastards, 1 public mistress, rumours of tavern girl in Shrewsbury. You half expect to see a star rating next to each name, and then there's the hypocrisy. Oh, the hypocrisy! It's one thing to sin, it's another to condemn others for the same sins while doing it with a choir boy behind the pulpit. You listen to a sermon where the priest rails against wanton women and fleshly appetites, voice shaking with outrage. He pounds the lectern, warns of eternal fire, calls adulteresses sows in silk. Later that night you see him slipping into the back door of the rectory with a young woman in tow, her hair uncovered, her steps hesitant. And yet, the people rarely punished him. Why? Because challenging the clergy meant challenging the very structure of spiritual authority. If the priest is corrupt, what does that say about your confession? Your baptism? Your soul? It was easier, safer, to condemn the women involved. Easier to believe that they seduced the poor, weak-willed priest, that he was just a man led astray, that his heart somehow remained holy. That brings us to your scholarly debate. Was the Tudor Church complicit in these affairs, or simply overwhelmed? Some historians argue that bishops and religious councils knew full well about their clergy's sexual misconduct, but chose to overlook it unless it became a public embarrassment. Others say the Church genuinely tried to root it out, but was spread too thin, especially during the political and religious whiplash of the 16th century. Either way, the result was the same. Spiritual authority undercut by whispered scandal. But it wasn't just priests. Monks in dissolved monasteries were sometimes accused of keeping private cells for special guests, usually women. Nuns, too, were not immune to suspicion. A convent near York was investigated after a local landowner claimed his daughter was led astray by a novice. No charges were filed. The records mysteriously disappeared. You can almost hear the silence still humming in the cloisters. You find yourself in the vestry now, where vestments hang like ghostly figures and candle wax crusts the corners. There's a journal tucked in a drawer, half sermon drafts, half confessions. No names, just phrases like, "I touched her hand too, long, and she looked at me in the gallery." You wonder who wrote it. You wonder if they're still preaching. And through all this, the people kept praying. They came to Mass. They took communion. They confessed to men who might be sinning worse than they were. Because what choice did they have? The church wasn't just a building. It was the system. To challenge it meant spiritual danger, social exile. So instead, they whispered. They mocked. They told stories over ale and hoped their daughters wouldn't catch the priest's eye. As you step back into the nave, the choir begins to sing. It's beautiful, haunting, sacred. You close your eyes and listen. For a moment, it almost feels pure. But you know better. You know there's something dark stitched into the velvet and gold. Because here, in the house of God, the greatest sin wasn't always lust. It was hypocrisy. Next, we leave the sacred and head into the diseased. Because when plague swept through Tudor streets, people didn't just blame rats. They blamed sin. And adultery, with its contagious passion, became another kind of infection. You're walking through a Tudor street now, but something's changed in the air. It smells different. Less of livestock and bread ovens, more of rot and smoke. The windows are shuttered. The bells toll more often. The doors are marked with black crosses and words scrawled in chalk. God have mercy. You know what this is. You're in the plague years now. The world is tighter, angrier, more afraid. And in this fear, everything becomes suspect. Bodies, breath, and yes, even sin. Especially sin. Because when the bubonic plague swept through England again and again in the 1500s, people didn't just run. They searched for why, and adultery in their minds was just another poison in the blood. The logic, if you can call it that, was terrifyingly simple. Plague was divine punishment, a holy correction. If God let the fleas and rats loose, it must have been because someone somewhere broke his rules. And in a culture where adultery already carried social and legal weight, it didn't take long for the leap to happen. People began whispering that cheaters were carriers, that those who defiled the sanctity of marriage also defiled the community, that sin, like disease, spread faster in the dark. You hear this theory in the market square where two women clutching baskets mutter behind their shawls. "She slept with her neighbour's husband," one says, nodding toward a shuttered house. "No wonder they're all dead." The other crosses herself. No one knows for sure, of course, but certainty isn't required, just belief. And belief, in Tudor England, was as potent as infection. You pass through a church where the pews are mostly empty. The priest coughs between prayers, his voice cracking as he begs the Lord for mercy on the unclean. But even as he speaks, you can hear the judgment in his tone. He's not just talking about bodily sickness. He's talking about moral sickness. Whispers swirl that those who suffer hardest are those who've strayed from their vows. The harlot's throat closes first, someone writes in a letter. You don't even know who they mean anymore. Maybe they don't either, but it doesn't stop the story from spreading. Here's your fringe fact. Some Tudor physicians actually believed that sexual sin weakened the body's resistance to disease. One medical theory claimed that intercourse outside of marriage heated the blood in ways that made it easier for pestilence to enter. Another insisted that the sin of lust created a foul vapour in the lungs. Never mind fleas or hygiene or proximity to infected corpses, the real danger, according to some, was a broken vow. You could wash your hands all you wanted. If your soul was dirty, the plague would find you. So what happens when an adulterer gets sick? Nothing good. You find one such man, let's call him John, lying in the back room of his cottage. His breath rattles like a sack of stones. His wife sits beside him, face pale, clutching a damp cloth. She's the one who begged for help when he fell ill, but the neighbours refused to come. The priest delayed the visit. "Let the Lord sort him," they said. Because John was known for wandering eyes, for lingering at the alehouse too long, for that incident last summer with the miller's wife. No proof, just suspicion. But that's enough. John dies 2 days later. No funeral procession, no burial in consecrated ground. The gravedigger leaves him in a pit with others, no marker. His wife moves away weeks later, taking only what she can carry. In this plague-haunted version of Tudor justice, even the dying get sorted by reputation. But it wasn't all passive cruelty. Some communities took things further. There are reports, rare but not unheard of people being forcibly quarantined because of moral suspicion. A woman in Derbyshire was locked inside her home with her children after someone claimed she'd brought shame to her marriage bed. No symptoms yet, but plenty of rumours. 2 weeks later, she was dead. Whether from plague or despair, no one knows. And while the plague sharpened the edges of punishment, it also magnified hypocrisy. You overhear a man scolding his daughter for walking with a neighbour boy, calling her a temptress and warning that her sin could doom them all. The same man was seen leaving a widow's cottage after dark twice, but he's not sick. Not yet. And while he might be called careless, no one calls him cursed. Here's the scholarly debate that historians still wrestle with. Did the plague actually change how adultery was punished, or just how it was perceived? Some argue that the fear of disease gave communities an excuse to act on their existing prejudices, cutting off the sinners, both figuratively and literally. Others say the plague didn't change the rules at all, just heightened the panic. That sin was always a convenient scapegoat in Tudor theology, and adultery was just the easiest target when things went bad. Either way, the result was the same. Adulterers became disease vectors, morally and physically. They were shunned, punished, sometimes abandoned in the very moment they needed help most. You pass a field where bodies are being buried. Quick, shallow graves, no names, no prayers. The man digging the pit wipes his brow and mutters, "They should have kept to their vows," but not everyone agrees. You find a woman kneeling outside a cottage, weeping. Her sister died of plague and the town called her an adulteress. She never did anything wrong, the woman says. She just laughed too loud and wore blue. That's all it took. And isn't that the real horror? That in a time of sickness, when mercy was most needed, Tudor society leaned into cruelty, into judgment, into a desperate attempt to find someone to blame. You walk away from the village as the bell tolls again. Another death, another body, another sin marked off the ledger. But next, you head back to the royal circle, because when adultery crept too close to the bloodline, when the lovers wore crowns and shared bloodlines, the scandal didn't just ruin lives, it threatened the very throne. You find yourself back in the great halls of power now, where the marble is polished and the air is perfumed, but the stakes, they've never been higher. Because this time, the whispers of adultery don't point to a miller's wife or a courtier's mistress. No, this time, the rumours reach straight into the royal bloodline. This is where the scandal turns venomous, where adultery isn't just sin or shame, it's treason in silk gloves. Because when those in the royal family are suspected of infidelity, it's not just their reputations at risk, it's the succession, the legitimacy of kings, the safety of the entire realm. You're standing in the gallery of a palace, Hampton Court perhaps, listening to the footsteps of courtiers shuffle behind brocade curtains. They're talking not loudly, but with the kind of intensity that makes your skin prickle. There's a name being passed around, a noblewoman, highborn, close to the king, and another name, a cousin, also noble, also powerful, too powerful maybe. The gossip doesn't stop at an affair. It slides, like oil on water, towards something darker, incest, conspiracy, a love that violates not only marital vows but blood itself. These rumours aren't new. You think of Anne Boleyn again, her name echoing through every Tudor scandal like a ghost that never quite fades. Her trial included charges of incest with her brother, George Boleyn. Historians today still argue over how much of it was fabricated, but at the time, the accusation landed like a guillotine. The crime wasn't just adultery, it was treason through contamination. If a queen bore a child not of royal seed, the entire line of succession could be compromised. And if that child came from within the same family line, it wasn't just scandalous, it was monstrous. You walk past a portrait now, one of those stiff, elegant Tudor paintings, where everyone looks like they're holding in a terrible secret. The man has eyes too closely set to the queen's. The curve of their smiles almost match. You wonder what people whispered then, behind goblets and folded fans. The court was always watching, always counting days, comparing features, reading too much into the colour of a child's hair. But this isn't just about actual affairs. Sometimes, all it took was the suggestion of royal blood mixing with anything it shouldn't. You hear the story of a princess, Margaret Tudor, sister to Henry VIII, who, after her second marriage, was rumoured to have taken a lover while Queen of Scots. The claim wasn't proven, but the damage was done. Her reputation tarnished, her marriage rocked, her authority in question, and it all started with a letter, one badly timed line about affection from a nobleman. That was all it took. Here's your fringe fact. In some Tudor portraits of royal children, their features were deliberately softened or blurred to obscure any inconvenient resemblance. Some artists, it's said, were instructed to idolise the child, make the nose more like the king's, the eyes more neutral. In a world where paintings were evidence, beauty was political insurance, and what happens when the king himself is accused of illegitimacy? You find a story tucked in a dusty ledger, a half-erased accusation that Henry Fitzroy, Henry VIII's acknowledged but illegitimate son, may have been the result not of lust but of a misstep by his mother, Elizabeth Blount. It didn't stick. The king loved the boy, saw him as a kind of backup heir. But the rumour was there, barely whispered. And in Tudor England, even the thinnest whisper could be fatal. The court didn't need proof. It needed tension. And nothing stirred the pot like suggesting that the royal family tree was tangled. If you could hint that a prince wasn't truly of noble blood, or worse, born of adultery, you could delegitimise him, knock him out of the line of succession, and maybe even install someone more convenient in his place. It was political warfare disguised as moral outrage. That's the scholarly debate here. Were these accusations truly rooted in concerns about morality and lineage, or were they tactical weapons? Some historians argue that noble families used adultery as a tool, a way to discredit rivals, remove inconvenient heirs, or curry favour with the crown by exposing others' sins. Others insist that the obsession with purity, especially royal purity, was deeply sincere, that the English saw themselves as chosen by God, and that a single adulterous act within the royal line could spiritually endanger the entire nation. Either way, the effects were the same: scandal, fear, and blood. You find yourself in the royal nursery now. It's quiet here. The walls are painted with pastoral scenes, soft animals, and shepherds that look unnaturally serene. A nurse rocks a child to sleep. The baby yawns, unaware that the shape of its chin might someday be analysed like evidence in a trial. You think of Elizabeth Etherna, child of Anne Boleyn. Her legitimacy questioned her entire life, called a bastard by some, a queen by others. And yet she rose, lived unmarried, had no heirs. Perhaps she knew too well the risks of mixing blood and desire. And then there are the rumours that never make it to trial, the ones that linger for centuries. Did Mary Tudor take lovers in her loneliness? Did Henry VIII ever suspect Elizabeth of being not his? Did anyone ever truly believe that royal bloodlines were free of scandal? Doubt it. But what mattered wasn't truth. It was belief, the image, the illusion. You leave the nursery and pass a hallway lined with coats of arms, each one a declaration of blood and honour passed from one generation to the next. But behind each symbol, you now see the shadow of doubt, the secrets, the lies tucked beneath coronets. Because in Tudor England, adultery wasn't just a crime against your spouse, it was a crime against history. And next, we turn the weapon around. We look at the lovers themselves, not the cheaters, but the seducers. Because sometimes adultery wasn't born of passion. Sometimes it was orchestrated, political, tactical. Sometimes it was a trap laid for queens. You step now into a different kind of room. Not a bedchamber or a courtroom, but something colder, more calculating. A place where intimacy is used not for love, not even for lust, but for leverage. In this world, adultery is a trap, and the bait isn't passion, it's power. You're not here to mourn another doomed romance. You're here to see how seduction became a strategy, and how men, especially ambitious ones, could be used to topple women like queens from the inside out. Let's start with the most dangerous role at the Tudor court, being young, male, and within arm's reach of the queen. Sounds ideal, right? Until you realise that just being near a powerful woman made you a suspect. And if that woman happened to be the king's wife, or sister, or niece, You were playing with fire every time you opened your mouth or accepted a glance. Because in this court, men weren't just accused of pursuing women, they were sometimes placed near them on purpose. Take Thomas Culpeper, handsome, charming, and in the inner circle of Henry VIII. He served the king directly, but he also, infamously, spent late hours alone with Queen Catherine Howard. Whether they were lovers or not is still debated. There are love letters, yes, but nothing concrete. What matters is that the letters existed, the meetings happened, and Culpeper was executed. He confessed under pressure, his statements slippery and vague, and was beheaded in 1541. Catherine followed him to the scaffold not long after. But here's the twist. Culpeper might not have pursued Catherine at all. Some accounts suggest she wanted him, others imply they were both manipulated. Servants passed the letters, courtiers arranged the meetings. It's entirely possible they were pushed together so that someone else, perhaps an ambitious noble with an eye on the throne, could whisper about the Queen's affections at just the right time. You see, adultery wasn't always a spontaneous sin. Sometimes it was engineered. Seduction could be a political tool, and young men at court were often pawns, used to compromise women, especially those in positions of influence. Get close to a queen, lure her into scandal, and suddenly her position collapses, and with it, everything tied to her. Alliances, titles, land. Just like that. And here's your fringe fact. In some courts, foreign and English alike, men were trained, formally or informally, in the art of flirtation. Not for romance, for espionage, to draw out secrets during late-night dances, to charm information from noblewomen, to tempt the bored and powerful into saying something they'd regret. Think of it as Tudor honey trapping. Cloaks, swords, and smirks instead of microphones. You sit in on a court dance now, watching as couples rotate through a slow pavane. It's beautiful, but it's also a battlefield. Each hand clasp, each glance is measured. One courtier, tall, dark-haired, a favourite of the Queen's household, lingers just a moment too long at her waist. You catch the glance from across the hall. Someone saw, someone wanted to see. And it isn't just queens. Powerful widows were frequent targets, especially those with land or connections. A nobleman might send a younger male relative to court her, to comfort her in her mourning, and before long there's a scandal, a letter, a witness. And now she's not a grieving lady. She's an adulteress. Her property is seized, her titles reassigned, mission accomplished. Some historians believe this was occasionally done with royal approval, that kings and councillors allowed certain relationships to blossom, quietly, strategically, so that they could later accuse and discredit. It's hard to prove, of course. These things weren't written down. But the patterns are there. Over and over we see women rising, and then falling, often just as they begin to gain influence. And always, there's a man in the story too young, too handsome, too convenient. There's a scholarly debate about this, naturally. Some argue that these men were victims, caught in the same web as the women. Others say they were willing agents, ambitious, manipulative, and ready to do whatever it took to climb the Tudor ladder. It's likely both. Some played the game, others didn't even realise they were on the board until it was too late. You pass by a window where a scribe is copying down court records. There's a list of interrogations, names, of men questioned about inappropriate familiarity. Most of them gave nothing useful, but a few cracked, maybe under threat, maybe out of guilt, maybe because it was easier to confess than be tortured. Their words fed the system, kept the fire burning. The tragedy is that love, real, genuine, human love, did exist in the Tudor court, but it was nearly always a liability. To love someone in secret was to risk everything, especially if you were a woman with power and a man with ambition. Even the appearance of affection could be used against you. A smile at the wrong banquet, a poem sent in jest, a midnight conversation overheard by someone lurking behind a tapestry. And here's where the hypocrisy cuts sharpest. While women were destroyed for their affairs, real or rumoured, men often walked away with promotions. A young courtier accused of seducing a lady might be sent abroad, then return with new honours. Reformed, they'd say, matured. Meanwhile, the woman's name was never cleared. She was erased, sometimes literally. You visit the tomb of one such woman, her inscription half worn, her titles gone, but the rumours, they still flicker like candlelight. She loved too easily, trusted too soon, danced with the wrong man. That's how her story was told. As you leave the gallery, a page hands you a note. It's blank, just a piece of folded parchment. But in this world, even that could ruin someone. All it takes is for someone to claim they saw it past, that it smelled of perfume, that it was folded twice, which means something, doesn't it? Because in Tudor England, adultery wasn't just a sin of the flesh. It was a weapon, a rumour, a trap with a lace trim, and no one, especially not the lovers, was safe. Next, we move from whispers to roars, from secret seductions to public shaming. Because when rumours of adultery reached the streets, reputations weren't just bruised, they were torched. Now you're outside again, beyond the palaces, the chapels, the shadowy corridors. Out here the ground is rough, the air is louder, and the voices aren't hushed anymore. This is the marketplace, the town square, the heart of public opinion. And here, when rumours of adultery break free from the inner court or noble estates, they don't just echo, they explode. Because in the Tudor world, public shaming wasn't just a punishment, it was entertainment. People came to watch, to laugh, to point, to feel better about themselves. And when an adulterer's name hit the streets, the fallout was less about justice and more about joyless spectacle. You're standing near a pillory now, that infamous wooden frame with holes for neck and wrists. It's been used for all sorts of crimes, stealing bread, insulting the church, refusing to pay taxes. But adultery? That one gets special treatment. A woman convicted of marital betrayal might be locked in this thing for hours or even days, her hair cut short, her shift torn to show just enough for humiliation. The crowd gathers with alarming speed. Children throw eggs. A man sells rotten vegetables specifically for the occasion. 3 turnips for a trollop, he shouts, and people laugh like it's the best joke they've heard all week. And the thing is, it's not always about whether the accused did anything. Out here, rumour holds more weight than fact. If your neighbour says you've been seen slipping into someone else's house, that's enough. You might get called before the parish court. You might be ordered to confess publicly even if you didn't do it. Because what really matters is appearances, apologies, submission. You meet one such woman, Anne, a weaver's wife from just outside Bristol. Her husband caught her speaking too warmly with a travelling tinker and accused her of adultery. No witnesses, no evidence. But he brought it to the churchwardens, and they, eager to maintain moral order, made her do public penance. She walked barefoot from her home to the church carrying a candle the size of her arm, while the town watched in silence. She wept the whole way, not because she was guilty, but because the humiliation would follow her forever. Even years later, when the tinker was long gone and her marriage barely holding, people still called her Anne the Candle. Here's your quirky fact. In some Tudor towns, adulterers were punished with what was called skimmington riding, a bizarre public mockery where effigies of the guilty parties were mounted backward on donkeys, paraded through the streets while people banged pots and blew horns. Sometimes the real people were forced to ride too. The whole thing had the feel of a carnival crossed with a threat. Not justice. Ritual humiliation. Everyone laughing, but no one safe. You watch a skimmington now. A man accused of cuckolding rides beside a straw-stuffed dummy meant to be his wife. He's red-faced either from shame or the ale someone threw at him. The crowd chants nonsense rhymes. Children chase the procession with sticks. It's horrifying and oddly rehearsed, like a pageant written by someone who hates everyone in it. What's fascinating and darkly ironic is that these public humiliations often reinforce the very power structures that made adultery likely in the first place. Men held economic and legal power, and women, particularly poor ones, had few ways to protect themselves if they were accused. But in the streets, it was the women who bore the brunt. Rarely would you see a nobleman mocked like this, even if everyone knew he had mistresses in 3 counties. But a butcher's daughter caught smiling at the wrong apprentice. She could end up with a shaved head and 100 people laughing as she scrubbed the church steps. And here's the scholarly debate. Were these punishments designed to control morality, or were they just catharsis? Some historians argue that public shaming was about reinforcing communal values, reminding everyone what was expected and what would happen if you stepped out of the line. Others believe it was more about power and spectacle, giving the masses something to judge so they didn't look too hard at their own sins. Because nothing unites a crowd like a common enemy, especially one conveniently tied to lust and scandal. You slip into a tavern afterward, just off the square. The air's thick with smoke and ale and the buzzing tension of people talking about other people. A group of men joke about the woman in the pillory. "She'll do it again," one says, laughing into his cup. Another man frowns. "I heard her husband hits her." The laughter dies just a bit. Then someone shrugs. Still no excuse. And that's the thing. Public shaming rarely stopped adultery. It didn't fix marriages or rebuild trust. It just pushed people deeper underground. You talk to a woman who sells herbs in the next village. She tells you how women come to her in secret for help. Potion to dull desire, powders to prevent pregnancy, even herbs to cool the blood. It's all done quietly. Because if you're caught trying to avoid scandal, that too can be seen as guilt. But the public has a short memory. One day's adulterer is the next week's vendor or mother or milkmaid. Unless, of course, they were especially memorable. Then they become folklore. Names passed down like curses. "Don't be a Bess Sharp," someone says to a girl in town. You never find out what Bess did. No one really remembers, but the shame lingers, outlasts the sin, outlasts the person. You walk past the pillory again later that night. It's empty now, damp from rain. But you can still hear the echoes of laughter, the creak of the wood, the dull thud of something thrown in anger or sport. And it occurs to you, in Tudor England, justice often looked more like revenge with a crowd than anything divine. Next, we slip back into the shadows, not to spy, but to confess. Because when guilt got too heavy, when punishment loomed, some turned to desperate words and ink-stained fingers. And their confessions, they weren't just soul-saving, they were sometimes the final nail in their own coffins. You're sitting in a small candlelit chamber now. The air is heavy with ink and wax, the table scarred by decades of scratching quills. It's the kind of room where truth doesn't quite breathe freely, but where it often gets recorded anyway, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. This is a confessor's cell, or maybe a scribe's room, or maybe just a quiet corner behind a chapel, where people come when the weight of their secrets finally cracks the spine of silence. You're here to witness a Tudor confession, not just of sin, but of desperation, of fear. Because when adultery carried the kind of consequences it did in this world, sometimes the only escape was through the sharp tip of a pen. The woman before you is trembling. Her name is Eleanor. She's a seamstress, or was, before she found herself pregnant, unmarried, and cornered by a neighbour's wife who claimed she'd seen her, in a state of disarray with a certain stable hand. Eleanor doesn't try to deny it anymore. She's come here to confess, not because she wants redemption, because she wants protection. If she tells the truth, writes it down herself, maybe the church will be gentler. Maybe the parish court won't call for penance in the stocks. Maybe they'll let her keep her child. She holds the quill like it's heavier than it should be, her hand shaking as she tries to form her confession. The words come slowly. "I, Eleanor W., do confess. I lay with him willingly." She stops, looks at the priest, then continues. "But I was afraid to say no." And there it is, the crack in the script, the quiet truth hiding inside the louder one. Because these confessions weren't always clean, or simple, or voluntary. Sometimes women were pressured to confess things they didn't do just to avoid worse punishment. Sometimes they confessed because not confessing meant they'd be accused of witchcraft or defiance. Sometimes they confessed because their abuser stood just outside the door, listening. Not all confessions were written. Some were spoken, transcribed by clergy who often cleaned them up, stripped away the pain, the ambiguity, the humanity. You read one that begins, "She did admit her great fall, and craved the mercy of the Lord with tears most pitiful." But there are no tears on the page, no detail about how many times she was questioned, no note on how many times she was told she was damned if she didn't speak. Here's your fringe fact. In some rare cases, especially among the literate elite, people composed elaborate confessions in poetic form. One noblewoman wrote a 26-line verse to explain her affair with a court musician, begging both God and her family for forgiveness. The original's lost, but copies of it were passed around for decades, becoming both scandal and literature, a Tudor mashup of gossip and psalm. And what about the men? Oh, they confessed too sometimes, often under duress. A courtier might be accused of lewd dealings with a noblewoman, and if he was unlucky, or not important enough to protect, he'd be forced to sign a statement, often with language like, was led astray by her wantonness. The responsibility, shared but tilted, always tilted. One particularly brutal case involves a man named Thomas R. He was a clerk, smart, with fine handwriting and a reputation for charm. He confessed to bedding a merchant's wife, on several occasions under the veil of night, but he also wrote that she had offered herself as the serpent to Eve. He survived the scandal, fined, publicly shamed, but still employed. The woman, she was locked in her house for months, then disappeared from record. Whether she fled or was sent away, no one knows. And then there were false confessions, those whispered or written under threat of torture, exile, or spiritual damnation. The church wielded words like blades. Confession was supposed to bring peace, salvation, but in practice, it was often used as a shortcut to punishment. A signed confession could replace evidence. It made the court's job easier. It spared the community the discomfort of ambiguity. That brings us to your scholarly debate. Were confessions in Tudor adultery cases reliable truths, or coerced performances? Some historians argue that the intimate detail of many written confessions proves their sincerity. Others suggest the opposite, that the uniform phrasing, the overly neat resolutions, and the convenient timing indicate manipulation by clergy or legal officials. In truth, both exist. Some people confessed out of guilt, others out of fear, a few maybe, because they simply couldn't carry the weight anymore. You find a confession written by a man the night before his execution. It's short, more of a prayer than an admission. He says he loved the woman as David loved Bathsheba, and he accepts his fate. But the writing is clear, steady, and somehow peaceful. He knows he will die. But at least in his mind, the story will be his. There's something haunting in the way the Tudor world turned private mistakes into public documents. You think about how these confessions, scrawled in dim light with shaking hands, outlived their authors. Some still sit in parish archives, yellowed and brittle. Others were read aloud at church or posted on doors. Some were copied into family Bibles, black lines drawn over the names. But not all were so tidy. Some never made it to paper. One woman, accused of adultery but refusing to confess, was excommunicated. She fled her village and was last seen boarding a ship to Calais dressed as a man. Her name was later scratched out of the town records. Not punished, not forgiven, just erased. And that's the final horror of it. Confession was supposed to offer closure. But more often, it just shifted the blame. It gave the authorities something to point at and say, see? Justice. Even when the truth was twisted, incomplete, or dragged from someone on their knees, you blow out the candle in the room. The ink is still drying on Eleanor's page. She'll deliver it tomorrow. Maybe she'll be spared. Maybe not. But tonight at least she can sleep knowing her words are on paper, even if they're not all her own. Next, we leave paper and step into flesh again. Because despite the punishments, the shame, and the risk of death, some people still dared to love. Adulterers, yes, but also believers in something too dangerous for Tudor England. Desire without apology. You're walking now through a walled garden, stone paths winding between tangled rose bushes and low fruit trees. The air is soft with the scent of thyme and something sweeter underneath, like ripening pears or hidden perfume. It's quiet, but not still. Somewhere, just around the hedge, someone is laughing. Not loud, not wild, but warm. It's a laugh that doesn't belong in a world full of punishment and public shame. And yet, here it is. Welcome to the most dangerous kind of affair in Tudor England. The one that wasn't about power, politics, coercion, or manipulation. This is love. Real love. The kind that happened anyway. You think by now, after so many scandals and trials and ruined lives, that people would know better. That they'd resist the pull of forbidden affection. But desire is stubborn. It blooms in the worst places, especially when it's not supposed to. You find two lovers behind a garden wall, their hands intertwined, heads bent together like prayer. She's a married woman, middle rank, maybe the wife of a minor court official. He's a scholar newly arrived to tutor her son. Their affair began with poetry, as these things often did. Quiet readings, shared verses, the occasional glance held too long. Now, they meet beneath the mulberry tree twice a week, always just before dusk. They know the risk. They've seen the stocks, heard the stories. They whisper names like Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard like warnings, like ghosts. But still, they meet. Because in this rare, strange corner of Tudor England, love sometimes bloomed. Not in spite of danger, but because of it. The rules were so sharp, so clear, so deadly, that to love someone anyway became a rebellion. A quiet, trembling revolution written on skin. These were the affairs that weren't political weapons or petty betrayals. These were two people seeing each other fully and choosing to risk everything for a few stolen hours. Some called it madness. Others, especially later poets, called it the only kind of love that meant anything. Of course, it almost never ended well. You pass through a village where a woman named Grace lived. She was married to a baker, but known to linger too long at the well with a local mason. They were caught eventually, after a jealous apprentice followed them and reported what he saw. Grace was flogged, her lover fined and sent out of town. But after all that, when the bruises faded and the shame settled, Grace walked to the next village and kept seeing him, every Sunday. No more secrets, just a stubborn, quiet defiance. She was still married, he was still poor, but they didn't stop. Here's your fringe fact. In some rare court cases, juries refused to convict known adulterers because the relationship was clearly mutual and loving. There's a famous case from 1583 where a woman defended her affair by saying, "I loved him more than breath." The jury, mostly older men, found her guilty but refused the harshest penalties. She did her penance. He left the county. But the records note they wrote to each other for years after. The letters were discovered hidden in a thatched roof during repairs in the 19th century, stained by age and something darker, maybe ash, maybe tears. And sometimes love protected them. You hear the story of a merchant's daughter who fell for a travelling musician. When her father found out, he tried to have the man arrested for corrupting her. But she stood up in court, said she'd chosen him, said he'd asked for nothing she didn't offer freely. Her family disowned her. But they married in secret, left for Wales, and ran a small tavern together for over 20 years. Their story wasn't recorded in any great court document. It was passed down through local gossip, pieced together in parish notes and recipes scribbled with hearts in the margins. Of course, not all secret loves were so lucky. You find the grave of a man buried outside consecrated ground. No name on the marker, but local legend says he was executed for refusing to name the woman he loved. An earl's wife, perhaps. A servant girl, maybe. The details are always blurred in stories like these, but what survives is the heart of it. That he chose love over betrayal, that he died silent, that she, whoever she was, never married again. There's a scholarly debate here too, naturally. Were these romanticised tales of mutual passion real, or convenient fictions that made brutal realities easier to bear? Some argue that many of these affairs were deeply unequal, between men with power and women with none. Others insist that some of these relationships were real partnerships, forged in shared vulnerability and courage. As usual, the truth slips between the lines, half seen, never quite provable. What's undeniable is that the human heart, inconvenient and reckless as ever, refused to follow Tudor rules. Even with the threat of ruin, humiliation, or death, people still fell in love, still reached for each other in dark corridors and garden paths. You find an old window seat in a manor house, where initials are carved into the wood, W+A dated 1562. The woman who lived here married someone else. The man disappeared from records entirely. But the mark they made, still here, still defiant. And maybe that's the strangest thing about Tudor adultery. Not that it was punished so harshly, but that it happened so often anyway. In a world that seemed designed to crush desire, people still kissed in secret, still held hands under the table, still risked everything for a glimpse of something tender. Because even under the weight of sin, law, and God's thunderous disapproval, love had the audacity to survive. You look up at the stars now, cold and distant, exactly as they would have looked to any Tudor couple stealing a moment together centuries ago. They would have stood here too, in gardens or fields or castle corners, wondering if what they felt was worth it. And always the answer came back the same, not in words, in touch, in breath, in the sheer reckless yes of it. But love, even the real kind, wasn't immune to consequences. And next, we walk toward the final reckoning, the long-term damage. Because after the trials and the shame, the executions and the gossip, something lingers, a legacy, a rot in the roots, and the Tudor world would carry the scars of its adultery long after the candles burned out. You're walking now through the ruins, literal and metaphorical. Stone walls crumbling with age, ivy curling over once pristine arches, broken windows staring blankly at the sky. But the real wreckage isn't in the architecture, it's in the legacy left behind. Because for all the fevered gossip, public floggings, shredded reputations and beheadings, the most lasting consequence of Tudor adultery was the way it reshaped the culture itself. The emotional and political damage didn't stop at the guilty. It seeped into families, laws, art, even how people understood love. You're not just standing in history anymore, you're standing in its fallout. The first thing you notice is how everyone becomes suspicious. Paranoia doesn't vanish after a few executions, it sticks, it becomes habit. Fathers monitor daughters more closely, wives walk a little more carefully through town, servants mind their words. Even long after the reigns of Henry and Elizabeth, you find records of adultery accusations turning into full-scale community fractures. Entire villages split into she did and she didn't factions, all based on a glance, a letter, a rumour. It never took much. You step into a manor house where the family line broke apart in the early 1600s. Not because of war, not because of plague, but because the heir accused his wife of infidelity with his own brother. No one proved anything, but the estate was divided, the name eventually extinguished. The house became a ruin. Ghost stories attached to it, of course they did, but underneath all that drama was just a centuries-old wound that never closed. And the Tudors, for all their flair and drama, set that tone. Once adultery became a matter of national crisis, once queens started losing their heads over it, it changed the moral centre of England. It made personal betrayal into a political and religious issue. After all, if a queen could be executed for infidelity, what chance did anyone else have? Every marriage became a performance, every flirtation a risk, every child's birth a whispered paternity test. Here's your fringe fact. In the decades following Anne Boleyn's execution, several midwives reportedly refused to deliver babies for noblewomen without an official from the family present, usually a male, just to ensure the child was rightly hers. As if giving birth in agony wasn't enough, now a woman had to prove the baby wasn't swapped or smuggled into the world by sin. Trust didn't just erode, it evaporated. And then there's the legal legacy. You check out the parish records and court rolls from the late Tudor period and into the Stuart era. Adultery cases didn't decrease after the height of Tudor punishments. They increased. Why? Because people learned how to weaponize it. Husbands used it to discard. Wives, neighbours used it to ruin rivals. And sometimes, just sometimes, the church used it to extract money. Penance was expensive. Public forgiveness, even more so. There's a scholarly debate around this exact point. Some historians say the surge in accusations was because the state was trying to root out sin more actively, especially in the wake of the Reformation and its hangover. Others argue the opposite, that the damage had already been done, and now communities were simply mimicking the court, using adultery as the ultimate social wrecking ball. Either way, you end up with a culture where being seen as unfaithful could be just as damaging as actually being so. And what about love? That poor, worn-out concept. You find its fingerprints everywhere, in sonnets and court masks, in music and embroidery. But it's always shadowed by suspicion. Even the great romantic stories of the era carry a note of doubt. Was she faithful? Was he loyal? Could anyone be trusted? You see it in the plays of the time too. Shakespeare didn't invent jealousy and betrayal, but he certainly gave them sharp Tudor fangs. Think Othello. Think Much Ado About Nothing. Even the comedies leave bruises. You pass through a printing house now, the floor dusted with ink and straw. Pamphlets lie drying on the tables, ballads about fallen women, confessions of love turned sour. You read one titled The Widow's Bitter Bane, full of rhyme and moralising. The widow falls for a younger man. He takes her money, her dignity, then leaves her ruined. It ends, predictably, with her death. Audiences loved this stuff, ate it up. Because scandal sold, and the lesson was always clear. Love outside the rules leads to destruction. But maybe the deepest scar was left in the homes, the quiet ones. the kitchens and bedchambers and fields, because all that spectacle, the executions and skimmingtons and sermons, filtered down into everyday life. People learned not to talk too openly, not to trust too easily. Women learned how to live inside suspicion. Men learned how to weaponize it. Children grew up in households where silence was safer than love. You walk past a tavern where two older women talk over a mug of cider. One says, "It's better not to love too much. Just keep your peace and your house clean." The other nods, adding, "Too much feeling turns to trouble." They don't say why. They don't have to. The history's in their bones, and yet, despite all the damage, people still loved, still betrayed, still risked it. Because the heart is a stupid, beautiful thing, and Tudor England, for all its fire and fury, couldn't kill that. It could shame it, scare it, punish it. But it couldn't destroy the core truth that people will always reach for warmth, even if it burns them. So now you walk one last time down a Tudor street, stones slick from evening rain, shutters closed, a dog barking somewhere in the dark. You think of all the women who were accused, all the men who were punished, all the letters burned and kisses stolen and names carved into wood. You think of the blood spilled and the lies told and the slow, sad rot of trust turned to dust. But more than that, you think of the hearts that beat anyway. And as the lamps go out one by one, you take a breath and get ready to close the curtain. Because this story is ending, but first we rest. We wind down. We let the fire go low and the noise fade away. One last chapter, soft and slow. So here we are, at the edge of the firelight, the candles burning low, the embers sighing quietly in the hearth. After 29 chapters of secrets and scandals, pain and passion, executions, whispers and bitter wine, the story settles. Not because it's over. Oh no, stories like this never end. But because we've told it all the way through, and now it's time to rest. You sit back and think of the faces. Anne Boleyn walking toward the scaffold in the soft May morning. Catherine Howard screaming in Hampton Court, already half a ghost. A weaver's wife clutching her candle. A scholar tracing love poems with ink-stained fingers. A baker's daughter in the stocks. A queen pacing alone, listening for the sound of her own ruin. You remember the way love looked in the Tudor world. Never soft, never safe. A feeling always shadowed by risk. It could crown you, if you were lucky. More often, it broke you. And yet, people kept doing it anyway. Over and over, against law and logic. They reached for each other with shaking hands, with stolen glances, with words that would echo for centuries. It's kind of beautiful, isn't it? In a brutal, bone-deep, what were you thinking sort of way. And now, the streets are empty. The court is quiet. The gossip has faded into dust. The queens are long buried, the lovers long vanished, the punishments long forgotten by everyone except those of us still paying attention. And you are. You have been. You've stayed through the whole journey, which, let's be honest, is more than most lovers in Tudor England ever managed. So tonight, you drift off not with a bang, but with a whisper. Let the story settle into your bones like candle smoke. Let it make you grateful for the quiet, for the privacy of your own breath. And remember, even in a world this cruel, there was still room for poetry,